questions?
Sure. Council work session to order this July 8th, 2013. We've got two items on our agenda. The first, transportation concurrency update, a continuation from our April 8th meeting. And the second item is part two of a two-part work session on reviewing our financials, policies yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So with that, I will turn this over to Dave Faber and Dan Urban for the concurrency workshop presentation. Dave, are you going to kick it off?
Thank you very much. I'll kick it off briefly, and then I'll kick it over to Dan over here. So start with a brief introduction and say, like you said, we were last before you in April. We had a workshop, a good discussion that night. I think we did. We talked about what is concurrency, how has it evolved since 1998. There's been many updates since then, and kind of a consensus that night that, for example, with the CIP adoption, the central plan adoption, the DSD creation, there's a desire to relook at concurrency and modify it to meet the goals and the vision that we have for development in the city today. So on that night, we had two tasks that we went away with. One was an authorization to update the existing computer model that looks at a snapshot of the current transportation model in town. And you all authorized funding of that on May 6th. So thank you very much. And we're getting started on the update of the current model of how the city system works today. And then task two is for tonight, was to come back to you with a work plan outline of how we're going to get through over the next 12 to 18 months-ish or so of interim and long-term solutions of concurrency, and talk to you about time frame and costs of what that would take. And so we're here tonight to have that discussion, and maybe Dan will emphasize this too. We're not necessarily here to ask for your full-on commitment or decisions, but we hope to have a good discussion and through the topics in the briefing paper. and go away and come back with a more refined work plan after this discussion. So that's my intro.
Thanks, Dave, and thank you for inviting us here tonight. Our formal presentation is very informal, so please, council or my colleagues, just interrupt if you have a question. And I'm actually more comfortable talking down here, so I'm just going to pop up and flip a slide and then be right back. I hope that's not too distracting. Okay, thanks.
Let me know.
My lovely assistant, Bob Harris, will be at the flipper tonight. Before I start, though, we had sent out a briefing memo, which just kind of summarized what we talked about before and kind of was intended to stimulate some thoughts and possibly some discussion tonight. And before I start on a PowerPoint presentation that kind of answers what you specifically tasked us with going away and bringing back, if you have any questions on the memo, would you rather do that first, or would you rather wait until the end, or?
I think probably, are there any questions right now on the memo, or do you want to wait until after the presentation?
My preference is to just go forward. I have questions, but you may answer them in the course of your presentation.
Okay, and the presentation, and the PowerPoint may give some context to further answers or even questions in that regard too. So first, flip, Bob. So we really have 5 things for you tonight. We have a work plan. We've broken a beginning to end new concurrency system task plan into 5 steps. We are actually in the middle of step 2 with this presentation, but we're prepared to give you an overview of that. As part of that, though, staff has discovered that there's really 3 things we're going to need direction on before we can really complete that work plan in detail. Not just complete the work, but actually put together the details of the work plan, which includes how much it'll cost, how long it can be done, and what we're going to do. And those are going to be presented in 3 discussion topics tonight, and those are what will probably eventually be a policy discussion and decision about fair share costs, fair share in this context as it relates to concurrency only. An interim concurrency system while we work on the work plan and get something new in place. And lastly, what I've called scratch or borrow. These are my words, so these are not industry vernacular, but scratch is basically whether we start from scratch with something that's, right out of the vapor and tailored specifically for Issaquah, or whether we borrow either lightly or significantly from another jurisdiction that has recently done that. And then we'll wrap up with the schedule impacts. We have those as bookend options, so the scratch schedule and the borrow schedule, and then the scratch costs and the borrow costs, recognizing there's an infinite number of waypoints between those bookends. So, thanks, Bob. Starting with the work plan, we presented what staff thought was some inefficiencies and some basic things we could improve in the existing concurrency system last April, and got authorization to come back to you with some details of a new program. That's done. The second phase of what will ultimately be, we think broadly, a 5-phase system is to look at the options, the opportunities, the costs, and the schedule. So we've completed that task. This has, at this point, this has not been exhaustive. This has been just to the point to where we can have identified where we need feedback from you so that we can continue on with something a little bit more detailed. So in the options category, we looked at recently adopted concurrency plans and concurrency plans in process from other municipalities, and that included Bellevue, Redmond, Linwood, Renton, and some others. And opportunities, we looked at what is currently trending in the state-of-the-art in transportation planning, transportation modeling, and urban redevelopment, specifically in light of the recent authorization and approval of the Central Issaquah Plan, on how these processes are kind of dovetailing together, how they can be synergistically arranged or managed so they can complement each other, and what those opportunities may be for taking what bluntly we've kind of isolated into its own element historically, but maybe broadening that and integrating it with a bigger process or other parts of administration so that we can be more efficient, more effective, and overall provide a better level of service to the community. Based on what we've discovered from that, again, we have bookended 2 cost options and 2 schedule options, which we generally would assume that we would queue up the beginning of the year. Both of these, of course, cost money. I mean, the small option, the big option, the fast option, the slow option. We're assuming we need a budget authorization and some more work from staff before you're probably ready to authorize that. So we're assuming those would start in 2014. And so we, in the interim there, between now and the time we complete, and generally speaking, that would be between 18 months and 24 months from now, recognizing that once we start en masse at the beginning of the year, there's either a 12-month process or an 18-month process. We have some projects that are pending that are fairly significant. Costco, for example. The question will be, do we process those under the existing concurrency system, or do we implement a new interim concurrency system for that? And we're prepared to give some background on that and some of the impacts on that. After that, then, we will, in phase 4, we'll take all of that information and we'll really get into the weeds on what are the specifics of what we want to recommend. What would the ordinances look like? What would the administration look like? What would the risks look like? How much would it cost? What are the subtleties, the nuances, et cetera? So phase 4 is really where most of the capital would be spent and most of the labor would be exerted in identifying the new program as it would be applicable and relate to Issaquah. And then lastly, there's some process to adopt that. Some community process and council process, and we're assuming that may take some time. And to wrap up this slide, we're kind of in the middle, finishing up phase 2 right now and ready to talk about 3 items. The first one of which is fair share. So concurrency is defined by and constrained to some extent by state law. And it includes the impacts of new development on the existing infrastructure network, and by definition is intended to return the existing transportation systems to the level of capacity or the level of impact that existed before the development. To make a very long story short, what all of that means is embedded in any concurrency system is at least some form of fair share allocation on the projects that a city does, in this case the city of Issaquah would do, what the fair share of those is that can be attributed to new development. Let's take any random new project, and I won't even name it, it's just a general project. A new development will use, traffic from a new development will use that new system, that new road, that new intersection, whatever. Existing customers will use that new intersection, new road. That new project, new intersection, new road, may displace maintenance or other activities that would have had to have been performed on the old network. So every project is really a combination of 3 things to some degree. Impacts from new development, some impact to existing customers who are benefiting from that improvement, and the impacts of already invested capital in the transportation system and that relationship. In order to fairly identify what is recoverable under a concurrency system, at some point you have to talk about fair share. Now this can be overt. Let me just describe one example for just for comparison purposes. We may take all of the projects in the city, we may put them in one pot, and we may fund them in several different ways. Some funding may be from bonding, some funding may be from taxes, some funding may be from new development, some of them may be from impact fees. In order to assign what the relative impacts are of those, I've looked at 3 things, and I want to make sure I caveat that that these 3 alternatives, or three investigations, which I'm going to talk about next, are just for comparison purposes. These are not real numbers to real decimal places at this point. This is a very broad kind of order of magnitude look, so that we can just kind of get oriented on the concept of fair share as it might relate to concurrency. So what I did was I took the existing 2030, the entire transportation improvement plan out to 2030. So that's a suite of improvements that is currently estimated to cost about $360 million. And previous, yeah.
Real quick, so we just passed current TIP. Is it that one, is this work, what's the
You passed part of that, so you passed a subset of that, the subset being that which will occur in the next 6 years, I believe.
Yeah, 6 years.
Right, so the 2030 plan is obviously longer range. What you passed was the first 6 years of that.
So you had that to work with.
I had that to work with, right. And again, I want to make sure that it's very clear. That plan was not developed to support a new concurrency system. It's just a what-if kind of test case right now. And the significance of it as a what-if test case is, we know from modeling how many new trips that $360 million will support. And so we can do the math to identify approximately what's the cost per trip. Not all of that $360 million of improvements could be assigned to concurrency-related impacts. Some of that is replacement of existing infrastructure. Some of it is road repaving, et cetera, stuff that would never be included in a concurrency plan. So I've just estimated that about $300 million of that $360 million is potentially eligible for concurrency-related improvements. So they would be projects that would benefit a new development. Previous modeling has shown that that suite of improvements will support approximately 18,000 new trips. So I'm rounding everything here, and I'm doing that on purpose so that there's no impression that there's a lot of precision in this at this point. So the math we can do is we can take that cost, those number of trips, and we can compare on a per trip basis or a per population basis or a per ERU basis, what's the ratio of existing population to the population that can be supported by that set of improvements? What's the ratio of the existing number of ERUs to the new ERUs that are supported by that plan? Or what's the ratio of the existing number of trips versus the new trips that can be supported? So these are two benchmarks, and they aren't all the same number because population doesn't always equate to ERUs using the same math, and ERUs doesn't always equate to trips using the same math. Obviously, a 1,000 square foot restaurant generates way more trips than 1,000 square feet of medical dental office, for example. But the range, the math works out that on a trip basis, the growth, so concurrency-related growth, is about 40% of what the total number of trips will be in 2030. On a population basis, it's about 20%. And on an ERU basis, it's about 30%. So we have three numbers, 20%, 30%, and 40%, that kind of define the relative range of fair share costs that we could possibly assign to concurrency based on policy decisions. So if we want to use population as the basis, trips as the basis, or ERU as the basis, we're talking about a number that's going to vary between 20 and 40%.
So let me back up just a little bit. It sounds like you took the matrix that we used in considering our 6-year transportation improvement program, looked at all of the trips that was on that matrix that went out a number of years, and picked which ones of those were related to transportation and growth, and tallied up those figures.
That's exactly right.
Okay. But that was just to get a feel for what it might be, because that's fairly imprecise in a number of respects in my mind, because that doesn't really reflect the Central Issaquah plan, and perhaps the extent that we're going to rely on non-motorized, improving the ability to get around by bike and pedestrians as we try to get away from single occupancy vehicles use.
That's exactly right. And probably we're missing the context on why I even did this exercise. So to move all the way to the punchline and work backwards a little bit, what we're investigating is We've defined and managed concurrency in the past as a specific project's impact on specific intersections, and then we've done projects to mitigate that. It's likely that we're going to recommend or prefer a system similar to what Redmond just adopted. And Redmond took a very different approach, and they looked very far out in the future and said, when we're at saturation, when the city has fully grown and reached its maximum sustainable point, here's the transportation infrastructure network. And in their case, they're doing much more than roads. They've defined their transportation network in the term of mobility units, and it includes sidewalks and walking and biking and transit and et cetera. But they've looked far into the future, looked at what they need at saturation, calculated the cost of that, and then identified, here's the growth that can support, and they've simply done the math to say every mobility unit now costs $6,000. So when a developer comes in with a project, if his project requires 100 mobility units, he pays $6,000 times 100, and that's his traffic concurrency. So recognizing that we may actually recommend a system that's similar to that, and an interim system could be more efficiently and effectively managed if we sold the equivalent of mobility units. This is the exercise that we were running, is how much is a trip worth in the concurrency context. So we'll flip to the next slide, recognizing that we've got three numbers, 20, 30, and 40%. So actually, is that next? Did I miss one? Actually, go to the next one. We'll come back.
Now you're going to test my skills on this.
Yeah, so I got this slide out of order. So I took that $300 million of improvement that we know supports 18,000 new trips, and I just divided 300 million by 18,000, and then multiplied each of those to get three numbers, 20%, 30%, or 40%. So if we were to conclude that 40% of all those improvements could be attributed to concurrency, that would be a value of about $6,700 per trip. Now recognize value in this context is that all the improvements in that 2030 plan divided by all the new trips that could be put into the system because of those improvements. If we were by policy to assign 30% fair share to that, that would be about $5,000 a trip. And if we were to assign 20% fair share to that, it'd be about $3,400 a trip. So assuming our interim plan was for the next 18 months or 24 months, let's sell mobility units instead of asking developers to make intersection improvements, it would probably be in the range of these numbers. Probably not significantly less than $3,400 a trip, and probably not significantly more than $6,700 a trip. Now the significance of that, and I think we go back one then, Bob. Yeah. In comparison, Redmond's cost, now these are normalized for an equivalent basis. Redmond is about $6,000. They call them mobility units, but I'm going to call them trips in our context. Bellevue's is $2,000, and Linwood has two numbers. If you're in their downtown redevelopment area, it's $5,100 a trip, and if you're in their residential areas, the peripheral, it's $8,000 a trip. So they've broken that up into two zones. They've done something similar to our central Issaquah plan with different policies and different approaches towards improvements in those two areas. So coming full circle now, the significance of the exercise that I just described was to see that if conceptually that as an approach generates a number that seems reasonable region-wide and something close to what others have kind of developed after a long and exhaustive investigation, and I think the conclusion is that yes, it's reasonably close. We're a little, if we adopt our 40% share, we're a little higher than all these. If we adopt our 20% share, we're right in the kind of the middle of all of these.
And so what, how do those numbers compare with our existing?
You can't compare them with existing. Because right now we have this nexus between the actual impacts and the improvements necessary. Now, I'm going to give you two examples to give you an idea of the range. The Rowley Development Agreement supports 4.4 million square feet of improvement with about $4 million in concurrency-related improvements. Costco using the same basis, would support about $1.5 million or 1.5 million square feet of improvement, with somewhere in the range of $18 million worth of concurrency-related improvements. So we're an order of magnitude or more difference between two projects that are pretty close, that are both in the Central Issaquah plan and pretty close geographically. We have not broadly defined concurrency. I don't want to say that it's not fair, but to equalize or normalize the impacts and the costs over a broad group. Depending upon where you are and the circumstances of your development, concurrency-related costs might be very low and they might be very high. And the range is so gross that there really isn't a basis for comparison with this as an approach.
Josh?
So Dan, when you were looking at the projects on the TIP, did you do an analysis, or maybe would it be easy to do an analysis where you take projects that are in the central area and separate them out from projects in the rest of the city? Because using, say, the Linwood model, where there's a different amount, and if you had a different amount in the central area that was lower to incentivize development in the central area, so developers would pay less if they're in that core, is there a way to then look at the project list and say, okay, this is the value for those projects within, and this would be without, and get two numbers sort of like Linwood?
The answer is yes. We haven't done that, mostly because we just haven't had the time or the resources to get to that level of detail. But I would need to think about that in some more detail, but the risk of doing that is that it implies that the 2030 TIP is what we actually want to implement, and we may find that, depending upon other policy decisions we make, that it's not that suite of improvements that we ultimately want to build. Recognizing that there are, especially within the Central Issaquah plan area, there are going to be competing interests in that to catalyze development, you would want to drive your costs, your concurrency-related costs down. To encourage non-single occupant vehicles, you may want to drive that fee up. So, we've got diverging interests depending upon how we stack up the various other pieces for implementation and policy, et cetera. My point being, I don't think it's completely intuitive, at least not to me right now, what the best way would be to parse those out and what the criteria would be to assign projects to cost and come up with two numbers that may be meaningful for discussion purposes. Although I do think it's reasonable to think that we may have differing fees, one in an area to encourage development and one in an area to encourage alternative transportation choices.
Part of what I understood with your question, though, is what you're proposing right now is a approximately 2-year solution at the longest window, and that in the long term, a new concurrency system could very well adopt a policy similar to what you're suggesting. But at least for this 2-year window, it may be best to focus on what you initially put together.
That's a good point. The interim nature of this is really just to get in the ballpark. We don't want to significantly undercapitalize the program. We don't want to significantly burden developers with an overcapitalization of the program. We want to get something close to where we might ultimately be, because the current concurrency laws dictate that, let's just say we were to sell mobility units right now, I can envision a system where we're going to take money and we're going to hold that for 18 or 24 months until we know what improvements we're going to pursue, and then we're going to go spend that. We don't want to be significantly out of step ultimately with what our procedures and policies and basis for assigning benefits and costs will ultimately be.
And to add to that, right, the concurrency state law says we have 6 years. Remember that 6-year window to make that investment. So if we hold it for 2 years,
right,
we've got another 4 years to play around.
And the risk is if we sell mobility units, the first one that we sell, we incur the obligation to do something meaningful that fits our ultimate definition of concurrency with that money. So we incur an obligation to go do something beneficial in a concurrency-defined process with that capital.
So do I understand correctly, moving to the permanent solution, we would develop a whole new suite of projects that would support the maximum build-out within the city, and use that as the basis for costing out the mobility units.
Well, that's certainly one option. Now, personally, that's the option I'm envisioning right now. Personally, that's an attractive one to me. I think it implicitly carries equity across a broad range of customer classes and geographical areas within the city. It's easy to administer. It's easy to defend as being equitable and reasonable. And it allows administratively us to be efficient and synergistic with projects as opportunities arise, as grant funding becomes available and we can leverage the potential for grants, et cetera. So I personally like that as a concept, but whether we ultimately get to that as an extreme, of course, is what the next part of the process.
Maybe I could add, I'd lessen the workload. I hear a work item coming up, of revising the entire TIP, and I suspect the TIP today has a list of projects that meets the growth targets we have for years. And it can't be that much different than.
Hold the mic closer.
I have to pull it towards me, okay. The TIP list has got to reasonably cover the suite of, growth we envision for the next 20, 30 years. So starting from scratch, I hope we're not doing that. I can't.
Well, I
envision
mean,
we
there's
do
a
that.
starting point, but
Modifying.
we would reevaluate the project, and make sure that we've got a good suite of projects that's tied to what we hope to achieve, through the vision and the Central Issaquah plan.
Well, there's a concept embedded here, and I don't want to imply that I'm disagreeing with Dave, but the reason I embedded this in the briefing memo is when we met with Redmond to discuss the details of their system, they began the discussion with the quote that I listed in the briefing memo, and that is, you get what you measure. If you measure intersections, you get intersections, and intersections are safety devices. They're not efficient capacity increases. Now, there are a lot of transportation modelers that would argue with me on that point, and this isn't my opinion. I'm repeating what they concluded in Redmond. They discovered that connecting the grid was much more cost-effective in a capacity standpoint than adding lanes or making intersection improvements. Now, that may not be the case here. We haven't done that level of testing, but they discovered that. If that in fact was applicable in Issaquah, that might lead to a completely different set of improvements long-term than what we currently have on the table. So I don't think we want to take off the table the opportunity to start from scratch and take a fresh look at it. Now, that's obviously has a different budget and schedule implication than alternatives, but I think that we should leave that on for discussion purposes at this point.
Joe?
Right now, we have developers do improvements, frontage improvements and things like that for their property. If somebody's developing a street that has just been redone, those costs are small. If it's somebody who's putting in a brand new street that's never existed before, those costs are a lot larger. How do you find the balance between the developer improvements and concurrency? And do you keep both of them in place? Or is the intent that ultimately concurrency is going to take care of all of these issues? Or is it going to be developers take care of all of these issues?
I'm going to answer that in a real general way. So when you get down into the details, this description may not be completely accurate, but generally speaking, I think it works this way. The frontage-related improvements would always exist as a result of the SEPA process. So SEPA and concurrency, I mean, all of the projects can be administered together, so you can take all your sources of funding and all the work you want to do, and you can combine it in the end for projects. But legally, at some point in the process, we have to separate impact fees, SEPA, and concurrency. And SEPA will always generally be related to what are the near-field effects of a development. So those frontage improvements would likely be a SEPA-related issue, whereas intersection improvements down the street would very likely remain a concurrency issue. Now, we can combine the funding sources and we can combine the projects, but they would probably always be analyzed to some degree separately and separated at some point in the process before they come together.
with that explanation, if you have a developer that owns one side of the right-of-way and another developer that owns the other side of the right-of-way, can you legally, by SEPA or any other than voluntary, say you have to improve both sides of the right-of-way? Because, and then, one of the things we talked about on the task force is having a sidewalk that goes to no place, because somebody's developed it, and it doesn't allow the vision of what the Central Issaquah plan does. So when you have half a block developed and half a block of a nice street and half a block of a sidewalk, you're not taking the best advantage of incentivizing to get the whole thing done. And how do you find that balance?
Well, in fact, you just described the entire reason that we're here. I mean, that example is what started this entire discussion. And it is when we did Talus and Issaquah Highlands, we had the advantage of a master developer who chose whole projects to invest in. We have various landowners in the Central Issaquah plan. We get an application for this block today. It doesn't make sense to improve the street on front of one block and not do the others, which led us to the concept of let's identify all the improvements that are needed. Let's take a fair share. Let's work methodically to do those when it makes sense. So rather than improve that frontage when that development comes in, it might be combined with other capital resources and done later, or done sooner. That's really not the point. The point is all the project that's needed gets done at once, but it gets done at our discretion with funding sources that we accumulate and package so that it can be done efficiently and effectively. So basically, we're taking the developer out of that decision and out of that equation, and we're making that improvement when it makes sense and when it provides most benefit. Now, the corollary to that is you may have improvements that are needed in the front of a block that aren't done when the block is developed, and for some period of time there might be impacts to that block until you get to that project. And that's the importance of my description in the briefing memo of decoupling the micro projects from the development. You know, we'll all need to become comfortable with the idea that we're gonna look further down the field. We're gonna be broader, more global in our approach to these, and there will be short-term impacts as a result of that. There will be long-term benefit, and they'll be much more efficient and effective, but there will be short-term impacts as a result of that, if in fact we decide to do it that way.
Okay, I kind of got lost here. My first question, you said developer improvements in front of their property was inevitable as part of SEPA.
Right.
Now you're turning it around and say, if we figure what all of those costs are and throw them into a bucket as our long-term build-out, then we can address those as they come up as a concurrency rather than as an individual developer.
Yeah,
So are you saying this is a one or the other, or?
I was thinking of the other side of the street.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So in other words, the developer would still be responsible for their part, but we could go into concurrency and say, it's important enough for us that we're going to use the concurrency money to do the whole block so that the whole block is one thing.
Or the whole street even, right?
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry I wasn't clear.
No, I understand now.
Okay, drive on, Dan.
So let's move to, there we go, scratch or borrow. So, again, my own terms, scratch would be we start anew. The advantages of this are that we can custom tailor then a concurrency system to our unique needs. And we do have unique situations. We have topography and development and private land that blocks right-of-way acquisition, and we have some unique things that we have to deal with. This potentially also gives more opportunities for stakeholder participation. Obviously, if we start from scratch, before we have made some decisions, we can get input into more policy-related and higher altitude level concepts. And there's always the opportunity when we start from scratch that we would invent something truly extraordinary. The alternative to that would be to borrow. And as I mentioned, right now we're focusing more on Redmond's system than the others, although I don't want to predispose that or imply that at this level of investigation we aren't looking at others. But Redmond's appears to be fairly similar. We're solving a very similar problem that we have, and they have very similar opportunities and geography and demographics, for example. borrowing as much as we can saves time, saves money, and it gives us the added benefit of being able to look back at something in place and asking them, what would you do different? Now, we do know that almost for sure our capital section and our policies regarding funding recovery would be different than Redmond. Redmond has a head tax, and they recover a lot of the cost of their transportation infrastructure with that head tax. We don't have that, and so it seems like our capital opportunities are going to be different. So we're not implying that we would do that. I don't want anybody to make that assumption that we've leapt to a head tax without a discussion, but the rest of their system may be fairly similar. And what that leaves us to is, next slide. Schedule-wise, if we borrow, now I'm assuming both of these will start the first of the year with a new budget allocation. I think we can do that in about 12 months, and that generally breaks up into 3 months of policy and process discussion and investigation, then 3 months of modeling and developing a transportation plan. So the question, would we use the 2030 TIP we have, or would that be a different set of projects? That would occur in that 3-month process. Then about 3 months of council, and when I say council, I'm automatically embedding in their public review and discussion, and then approximately 2 months for adoption. So string those out, as you can see, for scratch. The first part of that would occur through the first 10 months, which would, obviously, since it's more extensive, there are more options to consider, more discussions to be had, et cetera. So the borrow process would be about 12 months worth of work, the scratch process about 18 months of work. And then the next slide, the associated costs with those, and I'll just go right to the end. I know you guys can read, about $100,000 for the borrow and about $350,000 for scratch. Most of the, well, the difference is not most of them, but the differences are fairly evenly distributed throughout the tasks in the scratch. There's more permutations there, there's more work to do, we're assuming there's more questions that will be asked, and more blind alleys that we would probably have to go down before something reasonable and viable pops out at the end. And with that, that concludes what I wanted to discuss formally, and would love some questions.
Stacy?
Maybe I'm the only one. Maybe I'm the only one who doesn't know what this is, but what's a head tax?
What's the best way to describe it? Business and occupation tax?
Yeah, somewhere.
Oh.
So essentially, number of employees get
Right.
charged a fee.
Fee per employee.
Fee per employee.
Okay. And is there a possibility of getting into the, so borrow, but have it a little more custom? So let's say we get into this and find that there's some things that we would like to be customized to our city. Can you have a combination of these two?
Yes. In fact, and which is why I described it as bookends. There's an infinite number of permutations in between these
Okay.
two. But bookends in the extent that I tried to pick, I was optimistic and tried to pick the least costly, fastest system, and then pessimistic and the most costly, slowest system. It seemed to be those two configurations. I'm assuming our actual path will take us somewhere in between the two. Because there may be, and even if we borrow, it doesn't necessarily mean we need to borrow Redmonds. It may be a piece of Redmonds and a piece of Renton's and a piece of Bellevue's and a piece of Gig Harbor's. I don't know.
Okay. And so
But
this-
the reason these three discussion topics are on the table tonight is really before we can make substantive progress on the rest of this, we are going to need to have a little bit more discussion and I think have some feedback on the fair share component and do we want to do an interim system or not? And I actually skipped a slide. We don't have to do an interim system. We can continue to do what we've been doing and process it like we have. As we described in April, that's not an easy thing for us to administer right now, but we can continue to do that as an extreme. And every time I mention this word, you know, everybody says, don't say that, but we could also essentially adopt a moratorium and just say no more concurrency certificates until we figure this out. And I don't think anybody is suggesting that, but it's.
You just said it, though.
Just pretend like it.
And so, when is the next time we're going to hear about this? I believe
We were looking at
a
September.
couple of months.
Yeah, to come back.
September. you will be further down the path. You will have, you would be asking, making a recommendation and briefing us on the potential for an interim solution or continue with what we've got or something else.
Right. I think short of discussion, hearing discussion tonight or direction, we would come back with what we think is a reasonable basis for a fair share number and what that number is. And with fewer caveats on the description about how we're arriving at the basis and what we want to do next, something with a little more precision and a little more definition to it. So you could sink your teeth into it a little easier.
And so the borrow or scratch has 2014 budget implications. So a decision will need to be made on which of those concepts we pursue during budget deliberations. Am I correct?
Correct.
So that's the plan. Other questions? Paul?
So you mentioned Costco already. What are some of the other projects? There are several large projects in development.
There's a developer doing due diligence on the mall property.
You all know the mall property?
Gilman Square, for example,
Square.
would be one.
You got a nibble on the Catterall property out on Gilman Boulevard where the sheep do graze out there.
So, okay, so, this is relative to concurrency, and I like the idea, we understand we get stuff in the pipeline, let's make an interim, potentially make an interim adjustment. I didn't move a mic. Okay, there we go. Make an adjustment in the interim till we have a new final solution to, like you say, be fair. I mean, not miss our opportunity, but also to be fair. But concurrency isn't the only part of this. So this is maybe not so much as a concurrency question, because there's the issue of impact fees, and I know we're doing work on those as well. What's the timing of that? How does this line up with what we're looking at here, timing-wise, for this program?
Impact fees are being reviewed for traffic and parks throughout this work year, with scheduled to come back to you towards the end of the year for adoption of those traffic and parks impact fee updates.
So in both cases, if we do something interim, as opposed to a moratorium, as opposed to just stick with the existing, we're looking at basically the beginning of 2014 for both temporary concurrency and new impact fees.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And it's reasonable to assume that we'll need to be very deliberate in keeping our concurrency discussions and our impact fee discussions separate, because they're dealt with separately legally and have connotations that shouldn't cross boundaries.
Okay.
Other questions or comments before I open it up for public comment?
I did just want to say, I think our goal would be to try, if we have an interim solution, which I think is the preference right now that we're recommending, to try and have that adopted by the fall if we possibly could, just because the challenge we have now is that if a developer comes in and we have to give them our current process, it's very, very challenging and very, very costly for them to try and make heads and tails on what the current system is. So I think with a shorter window, shooting for this third quarter, end of the third quarter, that's kind of the goal I think that we'd like to see. So I would anticipate at the workshop we'll have a pretty finalized product that you would be able to really chomp through and work through, and then if that's, giving that final direction and agenda bill at that second council meeting in September.
And, Josh?
I just want to, follow up on Bob's comment. I think whatever interim solution is designed is going to lead us down the road towards the ultimate concurrency solution. And so in that sense, if it is fast-tracked, then we might need to have more policy-related discussions about it, because otherwise you could end up in a situation where we have the current model we have this interim model that's something different, and then we have this final model that's something altogether different. And then developers are going to have complete uncertainty about where things stand, you know, from now till then till then, and from then till the future. And, you know, is there going to be a rush to get applications in under one model, or a delay to wait until the other model comes into being? So, you know, my hope is that somehow, whatever the interim approach is, it's rationally related to whatever we ultimately end up deciding, so it doesn't create mass confusion.
Just a timeline question, if I could.
Go ahead, Eileen.
So we're talking about interim being how long, Dan?
Until we would adopt a new system, so let's say 24 months from now at the longest.
So about 24 months. So we would, literally, this would go into effect, and the concurrency model that we're currently using would be eliminated. So then this is how they would consider their concurrency fees. And then, depending upon what comes forward in 24 months, there would be, as you know, Josh is saying, a third program coming in.
And I think what's being suggested is that for that 2-year window, or maybe it'll be a year, depending on borrow or scratch, wherever you end up following up, that cash gets essentially banked for that period of time. And then once the new system is in place, and we've got, assuming, as you talked about, if it's like the Redmond model, and we would come up with a regular system of improvements, the city would have a pot of money already to begin to make those investments in whatever the projects that would need to be to meet those objectives.
Well, and I think something in between the borrow and the scratch, as was being said. I mean, there's got to be some kind of a third layer in the middle here, as far as we don't want to totally start from scratch. And there's got to be bits and pieces of great projects out there from other cities that we can borrow and personalize for Issaquah. I mean, because we do have a unique, I mean, if you're talking about the grid system for Redmond, I mean, they literally are able to put together a grid system. Issaquah, because of the way our topography is, you know, it's not quite a grid. But although there is connectors and important connectors to put together, as opposed to just doing intersections. So it's got to be sort of a hybrid.
Yeah, Dan, you mentioned it already, and Councilmember Barber just mentioned topography. What are some of the other unique attributes or considerations that we would have?
Freeway and property ownership. So we have private pieces of property that are dead-ending rights of way.
Okay, just a couple of general comments. September's awful close. I think it will be a real challenge. So to have something before us in September, because of the complexity of this, I would ask that if you're shooting for that you get the information to the council in plenty of time so they can mull it over, and so that our process provides an opportunity for public review and participation. So it's going to be, I think it will be a real challenge. Although I wasn't on the council when the council developed its first transportation concurrency system, Dave, I think you were working for city at that time, and that took a long time, much more than 24 months. Now, I know we're much better. We're a better city council than that city council back in those days, because we're a bit older and wiser, but it was a challenge, and there was a fair amount of discussion, and I won't say controversy, but everyone wanted to get it just right, and that takes time. Paul?
Thanks, Fred. I know that was kind of almost like a wrap-up comment, but under the current system, it's an improvement or improvements to some intersections, and it's very clear on what the money that they pay for concurrency and what outcome they should expect. You mentioned earlier, even with an interim system, we changed that. But we create an obligation. So it was in the old system. It's very clear the tie between what they pay and what they should see, what outcome. how does this obligation, what does the form of that obligation look like compared to the current system?
Well, I'll describe what they're doing in Redmond, because obviously I don't know where we're going to land, but Redmond defines concurrency essentially as progress on a bigger idea, rather than a specific level of service or operation at any discrete point in time. So they've got 100 projects they need to do over a 10-year period. As long as they're doing 10 projects a year, they now by definition are concurrent. And they're choosing those 10 projects, they're lining up those projects in a way that gives them the biggest bang for the buck. So those that are most beneficial, that are serving the greatest purpose or whatever they're doing before the others. But concurrency is no longer defined as a specific capacity at any point in time. It's essentially progress toward a broader goal. So they do all the improvements. Developers don't do any improvements. Developers just write a check, and the city assembles those checks and does projects. So from the developer standpoint, it's never more complicated to them than, can I afford the mobility unit fee with this proposal? The developer doesn't have to worry about when that project is done, what it is, the modeling to support it, the engineering to support it. They're just writing a check and they're done with it. The city then is taking responsibility for essentially internally asking and answering the question you just asked.
So, okay, so the key then is we're changing our definition of concurrency. Okay.
Yes.
So
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I apologize. I have to get up about every 45 minutes and walk around. So you may have actually asked the question already, but is there, historically, I believe there's a requirement as to that the benefit has to be closely located, right? Isn't there for concurrency?
That could be in the current level service definition, but now we're talking about changing that definition.
Okay, so you could make it, what I was going to ask is if Redmond has any challenges with that, or if they've defined it such that it's an aggregate benefit to the whole community. It doesn't have to be physically proximate.
Two answers to that. It's an aggregate benefit to the entire community. It has not been challenged. So there isn't any way to sit here today and say what they've done would survive a legal challenge, but they have good attorneys and they're very thoughtful and considerate and deliberate, and I'm sure that they've taken all the steps necessary to assure themselves that it would pass it.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of the times transportation systems are highly nonlinear, right? So you add a little bit over here, and all of a sudden you get a traffic backup over here, and they're actually related, but they're not necessarily as physically proximate as you'd like. So that's interesting. Thank you.
Josh?
And just to follow up on Tola's point, I guess, and question, I think that does bear some significant policy consideration in terms of the proximity of the improvements, because, if you talk about, say, the Mole property, we're going to, conceivably create this gigantic development on the west edge of the city, and under the model that you're talking about, the city would take those funds from the developer and use them potentially somewhere else. If we were to say, Westlake Sammamish Parkway or the Highlands needs some significant transportation improvement because our CIP lists it high in priority. Well, meanwhile, there's going to be major traffic impacts on Newport Way as a result of that property. And so if you don't build something into the system that recognizes spending the money close to where the development creates the greatest impact, conceivably you could just have an anything goes situation where you're just picking, off your list for the aggregate good of the city, but in reality, the folks who live in that neighborhood and the folks who drive on that road are going to be the most negatively impacted by that development. So I would suggest that it does bear some policy consideration whether proximity should be written into the model in some fashion.
Well, may I respond? So we kind of talked about a little bit earlier. I wrote the notes down, Dan's comment about, it's all about a long-term benefit, yet there might be a short-term impact to the developer. And I think, so if I was a developer, I would want to know that going in, right? So what is your long-term plan? And if I do X, this project here, is the type of improvement needed to make this work, even in your plan? right? That could affect their decision to go forward.
It could, and the risk with even commenting on what you just said is to predispose that you know where we're going and how we're going to define it and how we're going to administer it. But embedded in that as a concept is the fact that under a scenario like that, the city would always be the one choosing the project. So if you want to provide benefit to that development, all you have to do is choose the project that's proximate to that development that benefits it. Identifying the entire suite of improvements and preliminarily identifying which ones you're going to do first, second, and third can always be modified with the actual development proposals that queue up. And you can change that order every year with the TIP, and you can move one up that benefits an area that you didn't anticipate was either going to have a big traffic problem or was going to be redeveloped. So the advantage of that is the city is always in a position to make the decisions in real time about how you're going to spend the money and how the benefit is going to be apportioned.
Yeah, the other challenge with that is, I think the comment you made earlier, Tola, which is that a improvement in one certain area may have very little impact in that area, but 3 blocks down or a mile away, it may have a very significant impact on traffic, and so that's part of that whole modeling concept.
And I think Torsten would be the first one to tell you it's not always intuitive where you make the improvements for benefit.
Exactly. And so that's, as we talked about, we would still anticipate keeping a model, maintaining a model, but most of that modeling would be for our understanding of how the system would work.
Be for our own
improvements.
prioritization of
Yes.
improvements, not as a definition of concurrence.
Of concurrence.
Any other questions or comments before Stacy?
Just follow up on Josh's comment. So in Josh's scenario, would there also still be some SEPA improvements in front of a project? And so
Likely, yes.
okay, so there wouldn't be nothing in all likelihood or
Yes,
possibly.
there's always the safety improvements to make sure.
A couple of comments. I think that there's in this whole issue of borrow versus scratch, obviously we have things that are unique here. But to me, there's a huge, in any sort of goal seek on this, there should be a huge weighting on what's been successful elsewhere. Right? It's to me it's a big deal. Engineers always, we actually don't like to invent anything. We like to just take things that have already been done and repurpose them.
And blame somebody else if it doesn't work.
No, I didn't say that. And then the second thing is, on this issue, and I know this is a recurring issue that you've had with some capital projects and whether they're co-located or not, or they're locally located or not. But I guess my own personal take is, as long as it's within the city, I mean, we see it as a state level, the state takes our tax dollars and then they put it wherever they want. As long as it's an Issaquah thing, I'm pretty confident that this council will put capital dollars towards where they're needed. And in your example of the mall property, I'm very confident that this council would not ignore the traffic that would be generated around the mall property.
Well, as Fred
So-
said, we have a very smart council. It's not this council I'm worried about.
Thank you.
And with that, Josh, I'll ask if there's anyone in the public desiring to comment.
Okay.
Or you can go up to the mic on the roster.
That's fine. So as usual with concurrency, for many years in the past and now, and probably in the future, we don't get much built. We try to save money. We spend money on other things. I don't see how this is any different. I don't see how there's anything saying that we are going to allocate all this money strictly to money for particular transportation projects. Especially, I don't see that we are focusing it on our goal of non-road projects as priorities so that we get people out of their cars. because at this point in time, everything is about getting in your car and driving. This doesn't seem to change that. I looked, and there was one great paragraph in whoever wrote that saying, and now we have a paradigm shift. And then it continued on to talk about roads projects. So while you said it, nobody's following through to do it. So 6 years out, in theory, we have to complete the improvement that we're gathering money for. We've had the same projects on our TIP with very little progress for 20 years. The projects that have gotten done have been complete projects done by a combination of developers and WashDOT with some city dollars. I don't see how this is changing. I don't see where the money is coming from for some of these massive projects that we're looking at. And until you crack that nut, I don't see how you're ever going to guarantee that we're going to get any of the improvements that you oh so want again, because we always want them. But it's not really changing anything. It's only, yet again, ignoring the problem and looking at a different way of counting it all. So, in my mind, this conversation must be a part of a funding conversation for all of transportation, which you guys promised to do a long time ago. And that means, do we need a head tax? How do we actually get money? We have a magnificent daytime population as compared to our nighttime population. Yet for office, all we get is sort of a measly little B&O tax, and maybe they go eat lunch. But we have the impact of them coming into town and going out of town every day. So in my little brain, it's like, well, what other options are there that we haven't looked at? And there were things like, well, really what we want to do is we want to get people to be able to walk to work. So can we use some money to actually have the businesses create housing for their employees in town? And they don't have to pay impact fees because they're actually creating housing. We want a demand for housing. If we include that in our entire program, then we might get some synergies to get what we're looking for. But going at it the same old way is not going to get us our in-town housing. It's going to get us jammed up roads with no transit and gaps in our sidewalks because we're going to use the money for something else, because we always do. And we have ever since I started this, and this is like 16 years ago or something. I don't see a change. So in the meantime, I hate our current concurrency, but I have for a long time. I don't care if you change it. I don't think it's going to change anything. I think it's going to confuse the issue, which might in the end be a bonus to slow everything down and just ratchet everybody into like freak out mode, which might be what this town needs to actually get significant change. So ball it up, tear it apart. I don't really care, because I don't think you have the capacity to get anything done at this time.
Thank you, Connie.
No problem, Fred.
Okay, we are now going, I think, any final comments before we move to our next work session? So Dave and Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're excused unless you want to stick around and listen to Diane and Beth.
Thank you. All right, see you later.
We'll take just a couple of minutes as we get set and relax. You look relaxed.
Yeah, there's some coffee and water back there.
view folders thing,
Yeah.
it gives you like the last folders you viewed, but then if you do show all folders, you literally have to go like this
Every single
to
folder.
get
Yeah, it's
down
not,
to
it's
the
not
bottom.
hierarchy. It doesn't go to the top level of the hierarchy.
It's not like a Windows
Yeah, right.
setup.
Or it starts at
That's
the,
the one thing.
Things that
drives
need to
me
be done.
insane. And the auto spell, gives you all the options for words, that sort of thing. That's great too, except there's a
Okay. Tracy's on the way back, so just a couple of brief introductory comments. This is part two. Back in June, we had some discussion about our current financial policies and where we are with respect to the first quarter of this year. I understand that through almost a superhuman effort, we have the second quarter financial results. I'd point out that the ending period for that was 30 June, and today is the 8th of July. So that required a lot of work, I'm guessing. There were some questions that were asked at our last session, and I believe there are answers for those. And there were a couple of financial policies that were sort of outstanding that we need to discuss today. And one would be what level should we have for our general fund ending fund balance, and the establishment, discussion around the establishment of a contingency fund. Some call that a rainy day fund. So we'll revisit the policies that we talked about. They've been updated, and see if there are any additional concerns. And I'll turn it over to our Director of Finance, Diane Marcotte, who's accompanied by her deputy, Beth Ann. So, Diane, you're on.
Thank you, Councilmember Butler. We've had a couple additional handouts. We've been working on getting a lot of information prepared for tonight. Included in what we just handed out is an agenda, and we, as Mr. Butler indicated, the first step is reviewing the outstanding questions that we had from the 2012 financial statements, and I was going to let Beth Ann handle those since she was the author of those sections.
Okay. The memo that we sent out on the 2012 financial statement review, the utility funds, there was a variance in the charges for services revenue between 2010 through 2012. And the change between 10 and 11 was 16.4%. The majority of the increase was due to the King County Metro rate increase of 11.6 for 2011. That's kind of a pass-through charge. And but also in 2011, we included a one-time correcting entry for prior period Metro charges. And so then the corresponding, because of that one-time change, there was a decrease from 11 to 12, and estimating the actual percentage between those years really is closer to 1%. So, and then the second question was why there was a $0 amount for 2011 rents and leases compared to the 2012 rents and leases. That was a classification difference on the 2011 financial statements. Rents and leases were included in the miscellaneous revenue and expense category, and in 2012 they were broken out. So we'll make sure that we are consistent on that in the future. So, yes.
I have a question. So, related to the rents question, so if I look on page 3.
Correct.
Governmental revenues increased $9 million, and part of that was rents and leases. Revenue increased $934,000. So from the answer here, it looks like a $934,000. Is it accurate to call it increase? Because it looks like we don't have an increase, we just changed, like you said, changed.
Correct.
clarification.
It's really just a classification, because if you go down, highlighted down below under transfers net, there was, in 2011, on that page, there was 1,436,000 as miscellaneous revenue. That included the 842,000 for rents and leases. So really, you should compare rents and leases 842 to a 934. So there was an increase, but not that whole amount.
So in the financial statements, would that be in a note somewhere that clarified that it wasn't an increase, it was just a change in the classification?
Yes.
Okay.
We'll pick that up.
And then I had the same question for the asset donation. I wasn't sure we were taking all of those assets in that 1 year, but more like maybe.
You mean the prior period adjustment?
Yes. So were we actually taking all of those assets in that 1 year, or were we just reclassifying it?
We had received the assets in previous periods, but we
Right.
didn't make the entry for them.
Okay.
So because we took that dollar amount for that in 2012.
But we did really increase that.
Yes,
Okay.
we did.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'd like to add is what is happening since Beth Ann and I started looking at the details in the accounting system is that we've been making a lot of changes that we think it will improve the accounting and the reporting, such as breaking out information, reclassifying, trying to find more consistency in how we're doing the accounting from one fund to another. And then also, at last year, we had to do what we call a BARS conversion. It's a state mandated accounting system. And what happened is we probably invested staff-wise a good 1,000 hours doing that transition. And what came out of that was a lot of inconsistency in coding. Like in one department, advertising was charged to one account title, and in another department was charged to another account title. So in 2012, we've been working with the departments to get more consistent information. We're providing them with memos to say, here's how we're standardizing the transaction. So particularly even going between 2012 and 2013, when we do the budget in particular, there's going to be a lot of changes because of how we are improving the accounting system. So then the second section is more conversation about the proposed financial policies. And during the same period of time that the council members were reviewing the policy, the staff was also reviewing the policies. And included in tonight is 3 minor changes in the overall proposed policy. The first one was we added some clarifying language about depositing. Originally we had that the deposits had to be deposited the same day, and actually state law says 24 hours. And we also included a clause that in some remote locations or when it's not necessarily convenient, then the finance director would have the authority to provide waivers. One of the examples would be particularly our pool on Saturdays and Sunday, there is no one there to receipt the funds or deposit them. So when the Parks Department reviewed our policy, we then added that it would provide some flexibility vis-a-vis the director to allow them to bring the deposits in not every single day. The other one was, one of the things is in our proposed policy, we said that the fleet management system, one of the things that we wanted to do was to create standard classifications and then set up reserves throughout the city based upon those classifications. So for instance, a hybrid car, no matter what department is using it, we would come up with a standard replacement rate. Instead of currently, we look at each individual asset. So we want to create asset classes. That's going to take a little bit of time because it's a new approach. And when I worked with Kelly Koosman from Fleet, he said it's going to take him a little bit of time. I was a little bit out in front of him as far as using this methodology. So it's going to maybe take a year or two to work with him and assist them in setting up these classifications. And then under capital projects, we added some additional clarifying language. Currently, our policy says that you can have a contingency up to 10%, but actually in our policy, it says for smaller projects, you can have a contingency up to $5,000. So we just added that clarifying language to make it consistent with our adopted policy. And then there was another section that we, and the other one was that project contingency can be used to change the scope as long as it's within the mayor's signing authority of $15,000 or unless specifically authorized by city council. So those are the changes. And then we did a couple of language changes, but nothing significant. So that is the proposed policies as they stand. A couple of detailed questions was the conversation about fund balance. One of the things is that the accounting system has changed, and we have a lot of special revenues in the fund in the city. And special revenue funds, based upon an accounting change, really are, in most cases, is just simply general fund money that council has designated for a specific purpose. So we have called it the general fund, which is what the traditional model has, versus what we're calling the GASB general fund. So when I was working with Standard & Poor's recently on an update, I gave them what we call the general fund percentage for unreserved fund balance. And then when I actually ended up really thinking this through, the question is really, should we be using the GASB general fund? When I did some analysis on that, the general fund as it currently stands at the end of 2012 is running around 21%. But you can see that if we use the GASB definition in the memo, it actually increases to 30%. That's because we maintain balances in the general fund.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to find through all my handouts. Which memo? Which date?
It's on the July 3rd on the back page.
July 3rd. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
With the financial statements
This isn't the
Yep.
main packet.
in the main packet that went out on Friday.
Right, but I
Sorry.
printed that out. Okay, thank you.
So my recommendation is maybe that the council at the policy and the budget level continue to look at the general fund definition of unreserved fund balance just in the general fund, but then when we report to agencies outside, we would use the GASB's definition, just because there's still some volatility in some of our other funds, like the lodging tax fund and the admissions tax. So currently our policy is 8%. We do not go below 8%. We would like to have an average of 15%, and then that would fall right in line with currently what you are more traditionally used to doing here in the city.
So that, in your policy document, it's at the top, it's in section 3, reserve and fund policies. And general fund reserve policy, general fund shall have a minimum reserve sufficient to operate for at least 1 month or 8% of budgeted expenses. And then it goes on from there. So I have 2 questions in this area. And I'll ask them both, and we can field them as whatever you think is appropriate. It struck me as odd, especially when I did compare it to, and I appreciate the other information you provided about the other cities. What I didn't see in there, although that information as reported there was percentages, not the 1 month or 2 month. So it seemed odd at the policy level that it would say 1 month or 8%, or 2 months and 15%. It would seem to me it would be more straightforward if we just adopted one or the other, like a percent level. I just found that, I'm not sure what value it added to the policy, and if it's clear to anybody else, to say that there's special value to say at least 1 month or 8%, or at least 2 months and 15%.
We can take out the 1.
Take out the 1?
The 1 month.
Yeah, well, okay, so that was an observation. And then my second part of my,
If I may,
okay.
it gives it perspective. I mean, we sitting around this table may understand it, but a citizen who doesn't understand 8%, it gives it a perspective of what the 8% does.
Then I would, and that I got, I
So the
thought,
combination of the two would allow you to say, okay, 8% would be 1 month, 15% would be 2 months. It just allows you to get a different perspective of it.
well, yeah, and the way it's written, it's like a dual policy. It's for at least
Okay.
1 month or 8%. It's like one or the other. And if you wanted to say 8%, which is approximately 1 month, then that would be good clarity. And then interestingly enough, so ours is written at expenses, and the information you provide with the other cities, Bellevue is at least one of 3 that based on revenues. So I'd really like to have a conversation about, a discussion about the relative merits or disadvantages of a reserve policy based on expenditures versus based on revenues.
I would say that the traditional model is expenditures. I'm not sure what Bellevue's thinking was when they looked at revenues. I think possibly during a booming economy, when revenues were typically exceeding expenditures, it's a more conservative approach by using revenues in an increasing economy. Because typically the expenditures would be a smaller amount because you wouldn't have anticipated that additional growth.
I think some of it too is your volatility on your revenues. You know, a city that has property tax, higher percentage, let's say 60% of their revenues are coming from property tax, that's pretty stable. If we have sales tax revenue and B&O tax revenue, there's volatility there, and that's really, you know, depending upon the economy, whereas your fixed payroll costs are pretty stable throughout the year. So some of those, you have to kind of balance that risk as to where volatility is resting in what is stable over the year.
And I guess I sort of look at, you know, what are you going to use that for? Well, you would use it for expenditures, you know, and that you have some control over. You don't have the control over the revenues. And I don't think we need to point out, you know, best practices is to maintain. Let's pick what we're going to use and use it, because we're going to use best practices. We're going to do what we think is right. So I'm not sure that adds much to it. And so I would rather see one or the other, and I like the 15% because the 15% in the table that you provided, that's sort of what we're doing anyway. It's 15% plus.
One of the things also which reminded me, in the city we just came from, particularly on the revenue side during the recession, our sales tax went down 33%. So if one were to use the measure of revenues, then the amount of your reserves would significantly decrease because your 15% would be on a much smaller number. So one could almost argue conservatively, the more accurate number would be your expenditures because they are more predictable from year to year.
And Bob, did you have something?
Yeah, you know, when I think of this primarily is like the worst case example, for example, when Katrina hit New Orleans. So, you know, their revenue, their property tax base was shot, destroyed. They had no revenues coming in, and they had no reserves, so they essentially had to lay off all their employees, and they couldn't even make significant progress in terms of rebuilding the city. So what you want to do is be able to cover at least, I mean, if you had to translate this into something like 2 months payroll to 3 months payroll, if you had, assuming the worst case scenario, an earthquake or something, and you had no revenues or significant decrease in revenues coming in during that period, you'd still be able to operate, you know, on a public safety basis and then hopefully the reconstruction basis and something happen along those lines. So 15% is I think it's a better number, it's a more conservative number, and then it would really set a minimum base when the mayor develops the overall budget. She starts with that number, but I think 8% was what's in the current policies, if I recall. So
Yeah, it is. It is what's in there current, and everybody around this table has been at this a little bit longer than I have, and I had the impression that there wasn't not everybody was familiar with the number. And it just had been, we've got budgets, and here is the number, and here's the percent, here's the percent, here's the percent. But the actual policy one, I hadn't heard much conversation about. So it almost seemed to me that the 15% or the higher percent just was just accepted as standard policy. But I had never heard a conversation on what are the merits of 8 versus 15%. And I don't know if that's the reason to change it. I mean, the way you have it written here at 8% is I'm comfortable with that. So I'm comfortable with the way it's written rather than just one number. I'm comfortable with the 2 levels.
Could you explain again, there was a comment, are we at 28% or not, or more like 15%? Right now, I mean, could you explain, there was some conversation about what we're really at?
Where we're really at right now, when it's just purely the general fund, we're at about 21%. When we look at the GASB definition, we go up to 30%.
Okay.
So when we report to outside agencies like Standard & Poor's, we will use the 30%. But internally, I think from a more conservative perspective, I would recommend that we look at the 15% and apply it just to what we would call the general fund.
But we're at 21% currently by that definition.
Well, this is used to do the GASB definition. But what you do is you have to, when you're sending money between funds, you eliminate them in order to get to the GASB fund. So this is just GASB.
You're talking the where it says
28. Yeah. That's just that is just to get us to the GASB definition.
Well, but it says GASB is 30 and it says general is 28.
Yeah, what you have, it gets a little complicated. So in the general fund, we send money to the street fund. Because we send money to the street fund, when you do the calculation, you eliminate the intra-transfers. So when you're looking at the GASB definition in the general fund, that deduction of 1.9 million is going to the street fund. If you were just looking at the general fund definition, you would add that 1.9 million back because it's money out the door to the general fund.
So do we have a document that says we're at 21, not 28 or 30?
We will in a few minutes.
Okay. I guess the reason that I ask about it is that to me, to say, let's say we're at 21, and to say we're going to go to 15 in the absence of anything else feels wrong. So to me, maybe the question is, how do we talk about fiscal conservatancy? Like there's been an ongoing conversation that various people have had about AAA and what does it take to get to a AAA rating, right? And so there's been a conversation about our 1% per year and the fact that we don't do that, is that part of why we're not AAA, why we're only AA? But, a conversation about how do we provide the most secure financial footing for the city seems like we don't just want to go from 21 to 15. I worry that it'll be Christmas in November, and not that you guys will propose funding anything extravagant, but I feel like that 6%, if it's part of a conversation on how do we get to AAA, or part of some larger conversation about financial conservatancy, then I'm a little bit more comfortable. I worry about just saying, oh, we're at 21, we want to go to 15.
Well, what's missing is the why.
Yeah.
Well, and that sort of plays right into our next discussion. Is typically what happens is when you have an excess, in the majority of the cities that I've worked in, we've created that contingency fund. Because typically when you get amounts above the 15%, they're often due to anomalies in the revenue stream, and they're not predictable. And so typically your expenditures in the general fund are ongoing expenses versus one-time expenses. So given that you've been carrying a good ending fund balance, recommendation is that you create a contingency fund to truly use that for emergencies. Keep the 8 to 15% in the general fund as a measure of managing operations for the general fund.
So we've had some good discussion around this. I think we haven't come to any conclusion. So just put that on the list, and then later this evening, we can come back to it if we feel good, and if we need to have the kind of discussion that Tola mentions, we can have that at some other time before we decide what to do. Joe?
Fred, it seems to me that rather than a contingency fund, what the city traditionally has done is just carried ending fund balances to cover expenses that might come up that hasn't come up. So it's never really been a policy decision. It's been more, let's have a bank account, so if a skateboard park wants to be done, we have the money there. My understanding of the contingency fund is more of a, you're not going to put your hands on it unless everybody agrees it's either an emergency or it's something that's bigger than a skateboard park.
There's an RCW that covers the use of contingency funds, and there are very specific definitions in there on what you can use it for. So.
Okay, so my question then becomes is how would the council look at what we're currently using as the ending fund balances to fund things that are unexpected, but they're not emergencies? Would we still try to maintain an ending fund balance, or would the 15% be the contingency fund, and then you'd have 5% or 10% more that you could say that's just not budgeted for incidentals, or is that a discussion we're going to have at some point?
We're going to have that discussion. There are two things we're talking about. The reserve fund, which is the ending fund balance, and the establishment of a contingency fund for emergencies. And now you're talking about the ability to respond to things that are non-emergency that were not anticipated during the budgeting. And are you going to have a source of funds to deal with some of those? And I think, Joe, that's what I hear you. In the past, we've used the ending fund balance, which has been very, very healthy to fund some of those things that come up in the end, because the question is, how are we going to fund a skateboard park if indeed we go forward with a skateboard park?
I think,
Bob?
yeah, one of the things that's really important about your comment is and you can help me here, is if you had to place a hierarchical order of funding, you would start with paying your bondholders, your debt holders, whatever the debt service is. Then number two is council policy and reserves. You would just take that off when developing the budget. You would say, we're setting aside 15%, and it just goes allocated to in this case, the 2015 budget, because we'll be developing the 2014 budget. So essentially it takes just cash, available cash, sets it aside into a future year. And then you start to go through all the services, capital, and all the rest of the various items, when the mayor develops her overall budget, and what that ends up looking at. But it's kind of one of those things that whatever that number gets set up, it impacts available cash for final services that end up being able to be funded.
So I guess a question, if our policy was to have a reserve of 15%, and currently we've got 21%, or if you look at GAD's, I'm going to use 21% because that's how we talk about it. So the difference between 15% and 21% is 6%. That's a pretty large figure. So if that was our policy, would the proposed budget spend that extra 16% next year?
6%?
6%.
The answer would be maybe.
You could. There's nothing that prevents you.
So really, in essence, what the mayor and the administration has done is we've gone over and above the 8% current policy and gotten
A
it up.
number of years.
Right, over
Or-
a number of years.
And
So-
we've just sort of come to expect it. We've been sort of frugal,
That's exactly what it reflects, is frugality.
or fiscally conservative, perhaps, is more politically correct. So, anyway, I'm sensing that we want to have more discussion on that item once you wrap up your presentation. And so, Paul, were you on a roll now? I know you've got a number of questions.
I wasn't you published this agenda when we got here. I wasn't sure exactly what we were going to do for our 2 hours or whatever, 90 minutes that we had. And I probably have 20 questions just on the policies. So, but I mean, in the interest of getting the most
Number
of.
2.
Okay, yeah, right, okay, I thought, it sounded like Diane was ready to go on, and I wasn't really sure about how much time we had allocated.
Well, I hadn't heard any comments, so I was assuming that there really wasn't much of a discussion because I didn't get any feedback. So if you have questions, we're certainly prepared to go through those and answer those questions.
Well, yeah, it's just, for what it's worth, and when we saw this in June, I mean, that was the first time I'd seen that, and then we've had a few things to do since then.
No, that's fine.
And then kind of, your edits showed up, on Friday, so this was my opportunity to really in my mind, and come up with these questions. So I'm going to take this generally in sequential order, and some of these might be really, really basic. Even at number 1, adopt at the fund level. That's Tola's thing, okay?
Sorry.
Individual line items can be adjusted by the city administrator so long as fund appropriations are not exceeded. But it seems like we don't do that. I mean, it seems like, so even if we're still within the appropriation, say, at the fund level, if we're making adjustments to something that had been more of a line item in the budget, those come in front of us and we're discussed often. Isn't that true? So, or another way, the way I thought about this as well is like, let's just, I'm going to throw a number out there. Let's say the appropriation was 100, and it looks like one of the line items is, instead of 10, is really going to be 5. So we're like, hey, we got 5 extra than we thought, and then another line item that was going to be 10 is now looks like it's 15. So hey, we've got that reserve in 5. We just make that adjustment and we go. Is that it's a simple example, but that's the way I'm trying to understand it.
So there's kind of a hierarchy, particularly in the general fund. Starting from the top, the council adopts the budget at the fund level. And then typically what happens is the city administration then sort of takes what you have adopted at the fund level, and the next layer would be at the department level. So if, for instance, if there was a reason to move $10,000 out of economic development and move 10,000 into DSD, then there would be a conversation with the city administrator to say, and the mayor to say, this is why we want to do it, and here is the decision. Then the next level is within the departments. We have a very sophisticated level of department directors, and what they can do within their budgets, like the departmental budgets, they can move things around with the exception of salaries and benefits. So they can't say, I want to not fill a position, but I want to spend $50,000 on travel. So they can't do it that way. But they can say, there's a training class, and it is $1,000 more than what I have in my budget, but I want to take it out of supplies. So that's the next level.
All right, so as long as because changes happen throughout the year, and sometimes sometimes our agenda bills have financial components within them, and it seems like the ones we're seeing or shall be seeing from this, if they're generally, it's going to change the ending fund balance, or it's the total appropriation, right? So that's really what this is saying.
Yeah. When it changes the ending fund balance and we bring that back to council. Also, what's really interesting is when we bring an agenda bill, let's say engineering brings an agenda bill, they're getting their authorization to proceed with the project, but because of the language, they're really not amending the budget. So then we come behind them, and we're getting ready to do a budget amendment. So we go through all of the agenda bills, and we pick up those things that have council approval. For instance, we spent the council authorized $60,000 out of developmental services department for the concurrency study. So we're taking that, we'll come back in an official document, take that $60,000 out of ending fund balance and move it into the department's budget. So we sort of monitor which things we think have to come back to council and which things have authority either through the city administrator or the department. And then that is typically reviewed by the auditor to make sure that there isn't anything that should have gone to council for consideration.
Okay, thank you. So in the next section, ongoing expenditures funded by ongoing revenues, do we have any, so give me an example. Non-recurring revenues that were used primarily to fund one-time costs.
Let's say we get $100,000 code compliance violation. And what we don't want to do is to assume next year we're going to get another $100,000 and hire another person. So you want to look at your revenues to make sure that they're going to be ongoing.
So maybe are grants also in that same category, perhaps? So do we do any special reporting to highlight, of the revenues we got, these were unanticipated, or perhaps non-recurring revenues? Do we report that granularity?
Typically in the general fund, most of your revenues you can, with the exception of an economy where you just simply can't predict it, a lot of our revenues in that particular fund are pretty ongoing. Occasionally we'll get those one-time revenues, and once we see those come in, then from an administrative perspective, we have a conversation about, okay, is there an opportunity to then come back to council to say, instead of spending that to hire an additional person, maybe we use it for a piece of technology, or maybe we use it for something else. So we monitor how that money comes in. For instance, we got $10,000 in some code compliance for the stormwater utility, and there was a piece of technology that they wanted to use to acquire rather than using that money for ongoing expenditures.
So we can track such revenues and their use? I mean, are we kind of doing that now? Are we getting that kind of reporting now?
You don't get that reporting. I manage it as part of my responsibilities in managing the budget and all of the city funds.
Okay. All right, thanks. Hey, under utility operations, it says, city-operated utilities shall show positive net operating results. Every time I read that, it just sounded a lot like a for-profit operation, but I'm sure that's not really what the intent is.
In a utility operation, what you don't want to do is you don't want to lose too money, but nor do you want to make too much money, because if you're making a lot of money, that means your rates are too high. So what you really are striving for is to find that balance where the revenues are covering your operating expenses plus your depreciation. So it's that fine balance of having a net positive operating results. Many utilities struggle in the sense that their rates are set that it does not cover depreciation. So when those assets begin to fail, you have to go out and issue debt for the replacement of assets versus the addition of assets.
And part of that consideration is that these are enterprise funds. Yes. I mean, they're businesses. They're essentially city-owned and operated businesses.
Yeah, okay, so I was just wondering if the way that's stated, I mean, your explanation provided a lot more color.
Well, and all the fees, any utility are for the ratepayers. The ratepayers are supposed to support that activity. And so that's why when you do that balancing act, you don't want to overcharge them, and then you also don't want to undercharge them, because then you can't, like she said, you have a sewer main fail, and you're going to have to go out and get debt. And then probably what you'll have to do is, if your rates have been really low, if you have to borrow debt, you might have to increase your rates quite high to cover the debt service coverage on borrowing the money. And so kind of that sweet spot is to keep things a little bit more stable instead of up and down.
Right, and what
Yeah.
Diane said was your operating expenses plus depreciation. Then that was like a special project, like if there's a big failure.
Yeah.
That's not either.
Well,
not
also some of it's maintaining an investment in your current infrastructure.
So,
You know, that-
so I think I just wondered if the way this is stated, maybe it's sufficient, but it seemed to me, I mean, kind of piggybacking off Joe's comment earlier about just clarity, it wasn't, I knew it didn't mean that we should be running a for-profit utility. And if there's really, the real goals are about, having, strive to always have revenues meet operating expenses plus cover our depreciation and with a little bit of a buffer. I mean, I think that would be more clear, at least for me.
Primarily, you want to make sure the general fund isn't picking up the costs of utility operation.
So there you go. I mean, so add that.
Right, particularly given if your boundaries are coterminous between your taxpayers and your utility customers, it's a little bit less of an issue, but in some cases, you could have taxpayers that are getting water from a completely different utility, and so they certainly don't want to be underwriting utility expenses because they're receiving no benefit from it.
And, down to number 9, under nonprofit organizations, I think I cheated, I looked ahead in your packet here, and I think you have some more material on that, so I'll go on. Now, maybe I'd have a couple language ones that are probably not, there's a couple things there's some words that just seemed out of place, or maybe stated in the negative and wondering if it could be stated in the positive. Like, under revenue policy, the city will try to avoid dependence on temporary or unusable revenue, or unstable revenues to fund basic municipal services. Seems like that was, I don't know, I just thought that was stated in the negative. So there's just some there's a couple comments like that.
If there's some wordsmithing that you want to do,
Yeah,
we have an opportunity, because eventually this has to go into an agenda bill
Right.
and be presented to
Okay.
council, so we have an
I'm just
opportunity.
I don't have my notes pulled out. I have them tagged into the document, so I'm just scrolling through that. In that same section under revenue policy, the 5th bullet says the city will consider user fees when the character of the service and its users seems appropriate. Could you elaborate on that? And I'll give you what was sticking in my mind, for example. So I know that we do some programs for special populations through the Parks Department, and I'm pretty sure the fees we charge for those programs doesn't cover the entire expense.
And that's why we tried to give you enough flexibility, particularly on, your low income and disadvantage. There isn't anything in state law that requires you to cover 100% of the fees, and you can have a sliding scale. So we tried to provide some flexibility there. There might be instances in some communities, like adult sports. Council has indicated that they want 100% cost recovery. So what we were saying was to provide you the opportunities to say user fees do not have to cover 100%.
Yeah, okay, so just that language, I'll read it again. The city will consider user fees when the character of the service and its users seems appropriate. Boy, there's a broad definition there. I mean, that could be applied, that could change from council to council, that sense of, character and appropriateness. I'm just wondering if there is
So would you like to see it more restrictive?
more, well,
I just don't, I'm not sure I'd even know what it means. So that just needs to be clarified.
yeah, I know of examples. I mean, we just spoke of a couple, at least a couple of examples, but it just seems, it struck me as that we use the word character, and that's a judgment. That's a very personal judgment. I thought maybe as a policy we should try to be more explicit. I don't have a suggestion right now, so I'm putting that thought out there.
Take a look at it.
under the debt management policies, I'm not sure, are we gonna go to this in your agenda already? We're gonna go dive into this area at all? Number 5, the legal limitation of indebtedness. I really like that section. I just thought that was well read. I was wondering if, have we ever received kind of reports like this in the past? This would be new?
In your budget book,
Okay,
we annually report the limitation of indebtedness,
okay.
so it's in this document
So I think I had seen that.
on 9-6.
Okay. I think I had seen that this was a new section. We didn't really have a policy for this.
Right.
Okay. Okay, well, okay, good.
And we reported to various venues, whether it's the state, whether it's rating agencies. So, and it becomes important that the council understand where we're at as far as what debt have we issued, where we at as far as our capacity. For the first time in history, with the decline in assessed valuation, a lot of cities pushed that limit of issuing debt. And what actually happened is, because it's a function of assessed valuation, the assessed valuation went down, and they ended up exceeding the state constitutional limit. And then as a result of that, in some cases, they got what we call a going concern comment from the auditor, talking about the long-term viability of the community. So there is a legal limitation of indebtedness, and the next section, Section 6, is saying, okay, of our capacity, we want to reserve at least 10%. And that is just simply good management practice, in that just because you have a credit card with $25,000 limit, most of us shouldn't be spending that $25,000. So it's sort of saying, let's save some of that capacity for future needs and future emergencies.
Yeah, and, yeah, I saw how those related. And is that reported, is that somewhere in the back of the budget as well?
The 10%?
Yeah, or, yeah, is
You
this
could-
reserve
yeah.
amount? So you are, as a practice, already reporting that?
Well, you can do the simple math. We have about 68 million,
I just thought if we call it out,
69 million, so we have in capacity, so our limitation would be 6.9 million.
is that when you call out a percent like this in a policy,
Yeah.
it would expect that maybe we report that, just so we can easily see how we're doing relative to that policy.
Because it's a new policy, we've never done it, so we can easily include it.
So, I'm sorry, that means that we have, right now, an additional bonding capability of another essentially $7 million that we're not using to maintain that ratio?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Down in Section 7, accounting and financial reporting policies, and I think you've said this before, it specifically calls out GAAP. Are we going to have to make adjustment? We don't care about IFRS, do we? Will we ever?
No.
Okay.
So we have to care about
GAAP is it forever
GAAP.
for us, okay.
Yeah. And what we do is, it is always difficult because our budget, and I don't know of any city that doesn't, our budget is on cash, and our financial reporting is on accrual. And sometimes making that transition is hard depending on what you're looking at.
And then in that second paragraph, that same section, says the finance department will also prepare regular budget status reports to keep the city council informed throughout the budget period. And I know you've done that. And I'm a really big fan of, whenever we can, that those are true kind of budget to actual variance. Now, earlier you said it says in here, maybe we do that annually. But
At what level?
at what level?
Because our quarterly report talks about the more significant funds, so we talk about the general fund and we talk about utilities. That represents probably about 85% of our total revenue. We do have some other smaller funds. At this point in time, we typically don't report on them unless we have some really, some concerns. If they're meeting budget expectations, then we sort of leave them off of the document, because otherwise then it becomes to look like a financial report that the average person has a hard time following.
I guess whenever we show actuals and you have budget in here, I mean, you have to do the math in your head anyway, right? Someone's gonna have to do that, just including the variance.
The dollar variance?
I mean, you're doing it as a percent, so,
Right.
so I guess this is a comment, it's just, I don't have a better answer for your question about at what level. I just know that generally, like, you know, when I, even, you know, when you're showing specific numbers, just they stand there by themselves. Well, how is that relative to our plan? So that's just a general preference. In 8, the audit policy, the city, such audit reports shall also be kept on file with the city clerk and shall be available for public inspection in accordance with the State Washington Open Public Records Act. Does that mean, so is it our goal too that they would also be available for viewing or download from the city's website? Okay, so is that implied in the Open Public Records Act, or that's just our own goals?
It's not, no, it's not in the Open Public Records Act. So what we actually do is when we get the audit report, we load it up on the website so that people don't have to come and ask us for it.
Mm-hmm.
So it is available on the website once it becomes published and available.
Okay, so it's just a matter of practice that we are making them available there as well.
Mhm.
Okay. Okay, so that covers, I have some, like I said, I had some wordsmithing things. I'll get back to you in a separate, thank you.
Since we're talking about this section, should we have, preservation of credit rating. Consider future fiscal impacts, additional costs of any future debt that might adversely impact the city's credit rating. If we're talking about having sort of a consolidated central point for how we want to do business fiscally, should we consider having a policy that says we want to aim for a AAA credit rating and we want each year to figure out a plan as of that year on how to get closer towards it? I think we should have a better credit rating than the United States does. Currently, the United States has got more problems.
You want that to be our policy, just always better
Than the U.S.? No, because, if they get back to AAA, then what do we do? But no, it's okay. I was being a little silly. But seriously, though, why not, right? Not just maintaining a credit rating, but let's always be striving towards getting back to AAA. Or not back to, because have we ever been at AAA as a city?
I think the challenge we've had when we just had the re-review is the overlapping debt. And those are outside of our control.
I understand, but let's shoot for
Well,
the best.
there's a cost for, I heard a figure once of $50,000 or so to have Standard & Poor's or someone take a look at it. I guess I would ask the question, what would it take? What's holding us back? Do we have that answer?
The overlapping debt is the primary thing.
Well, so I've heard that our policy of not doing our 1% per year, which I think we all have felt great pride in, actually hurts us in this area.
It does.
So it's not just overlapping debt. There's some other, and if there's that, then there's other pieces that I don't understand because I'm not a financial guy. Now, I guess what I'm saying is it should be aspirational, not prescriptional, right? I'm not saying that we should enforce any particular policies, but that each year, that we should say we'd like to get to AAA, and that each year we'd like to review it and see if there's things that we can do as a city towards getting there.
Well, then I would suggest that, during budget deliberations, a short memo or something that outlines what's holding us back. Is there things that we can do that would move us in that direction? And I think that's what I'm hearing you say.
And
It's-
I would say we're already moving in that direction. One of the directions is updating the financial policies. One of the directions is doing the 5-year financial forecast. One of the directions is the consideration of the contingency fund. One of the directions is looking at our long-term
So
capital.
put put it in a memo, provide that to the council with the proposed budget, and we can pat you on the back about all the wonderful things you're doing to move us in that direction.
But I also think that we might want to put the language in here that we would like to strive for that AAA and sort of annually look at how can we get there, right? Because this really enshrines how we hope to do business, how we hope to serve the citizens of the city. I think it might. Obviously not we're not
I
making.
see Bob making a note over there. Thanks, Bob.
Sure.
Other policy questions? Stacy?
Yes, I have a few questions. So back on page 8, number 5, the 5-year forecast. This may be just a language issue, but maybe not. It says the 5-year forecast should assume continuation of current service levels, including known changes that will occur during the forecast period. So I wasn't sure if my first question was, why doesn't it say shall? We shall assume continuation of current services. I just got different meanings when I read this, and I'm wondering if it doesn't say shall, because it doesn't always assume continuation of current service levels because there might be known changes. Is that what was meant?
Well, part of the goal is you want to maintain your current service level,
Sure.
but the reality is you need to have a balanced budget going out into the future. So if you put shall in there and said, we're going to maintain our current service levels, and it causes you in the 4th year to be $10 million out of balance, and there are no revenues, then you start having the conversation when you look at the forecast about, okay, where we're going, it looks like we have problems, and here are some recommendations for changes in services.
Can you give me an example?
Let's say that in order to maintain the current service level, let's say you lose a major employer in your community, and now you no longer have the revenue to support programs in the rec program. So if you put shall in there, then you automatically have a significant operating deficit, and you have no revenue stream by which to provide that service.
But if you said the 5-year forecast shall assume continuation of current service levels except for when there are known changes that will occur during the forecast period, does that serve the same purpose? Because it almost reads as if we're kind of being wishy-washy rather than trying to keep ourselves out of trouble. No? Okay.
We can change it.
Well, it's just something for you to
Yeah.
consider, because I wasn't sure what that was supposed to say and why. Number 9, nonprofits. Future funding decisions regarding nonprofit organizations will be based on guidelines, policies, and priorities determined by the City Council. When are we going to address those policies?
We're having an introduction to the conversation tonight.
Okay. Later, you mean? Okay,
Or at another time, depends on how far we get.
okay. So we just got, but it's a handout we got tonight, right? Okay, so I haven't seen that.
The only, to go back to your last question
Yeah.
on should and shall, as we go through this, one of the things that's really important is that the mayor still ultimately puts the budget together. So the more prescriptive and restrictive the policies are, the less discretion that the mayor has. So there may be, looking ahead, a desire by, say, a new mayor to emphasize or de-emphasize a certain service that the city is providing. And when they put their budget together, they'll draft it within that context. And they may do the 5-year operating plan, and there's going to be an explanation that goes to council with that. But by saying shall, you really are restricting the ability of the CEO to develop the budget to reflect, their current policies. Now, obviously, whatever that is still has to go to the council for review. But I just want to be,
Sure. And
we want to be cognizant of that.
And I appreciate that, and I just sort of didn't understand we're kind of trained to look at should and shall, and whether it should be shall when it's really should. And then as I read it more, I wasn't exactly sure what the intent was, because you could look at it both ways, so I appreciate the explanation. And like I said, I'm not suggesting that we change it to shall. I'm going to look at it again and see if maybe it could be explained in a way that's, we understand what it means without having to ask what it means.
Right.
Okay. So nonprofits, number 10, budget monitoring. Says city staff will annually evaluate trends from a budget to actual perspective and from a historical year-to-year perspective to identify areas where resources have been over-allocated. The intent is to improve the accuracy of revenue and expenditure forecasts by eliminating the impact of recurring variances. So when I read this, I wondered why it was just over-allocated and why it wouldn't be under-allocated as well.
Pardon?
Just, yeah, yeah.
I can give you a facetious answer, because just about everybody would say they're underallocated in their resources. But from an over-allocation standpoint, I think what we would look at is when we go through and the administration puts the budget together, they would look and say, well, look, this general area or division or department, you've constantly asked for X and you're constantly spending Y, which is this, why, you keep saying you need this extra $30,000, why do you need that $30,000? And I think that's the intent of this, is when we go through and do that evaluation, we're going to do that on an annual basis and make those adjustments.
Well, Josh does the same thing.
And he does.
Yeah, during budget deliberations, the council looks at that also, and those questions have come up many, many times during our deliberations.
So maybe a little bit of adding something here for context, if would help, because I really didn't have any idea what it was talking about.
Okay.
Okay? We've already talked about that one and that one. The insurance policy, page 13. City will periodically review. Do we want anything more nailed down than just periodically? Because we've had some programs where we were going to periodically review, and it turns into a long stretch where it's not even, I would argue it's not even periodic, it's just we're not. I'm assuming we do this already. I know we do. It's just a question. You don't have to answer it right now. And capital budget and planning policies, long-range planning, this is one that I would think would be shall be done for the replacement or construction of capital facilities and major equipment. And the same question I had on the nonprofits, when are we doing this? We talked about fleet management. What about the rest of the capital replacement plan? When are we talking about that?
We're working on a draft document of the city's capital improvement plan, but we're having to make some significant changes to the document because it's not fulfilling the intent of state law. So we do what we call a capital improvement plan, but you're required by growth management to do a capital facilities plan. And so we're trying to get in compliance with GMA, and so the document is close to being ready to be released, but we're having to do a lot of reevaluation of programs.
So at our last council meeting, we talked about the park bond and we talked about AstroTurf, or is that the right word anymore?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we talked about
That takes me back.
artificial turf, sorry. I guess that's a brand. And there was a comment about that we don't have a plan in place for how to replace that. So is that part of this? Is that the document you're talking about that you're working on that would address those types of replacements or not?
Yes.
Okay.
Is that
Assuming.
capital
I'm not
or
sure.
O&M?
Well, it depends on whether or not it results in the extension of an asset or whether it's simply a repair. If it's a repair and maintenance, then it goes into the operating budget. If it's a capital where it substantially extends the life, then it would go into the CFP. Okay? So we look at those from an accounting definition. If there's a desire to have a program for the replacement, then based upon information given to the mayor in the budget development, then there can be ways that the mayor implements that request.
Okay. So I'm just looking at knowing when we are looking at creating those long-range planning programs for planning for.
Well, I know that the council had a discussion, and it's part of the 2014 goals, to begin looking at our capital assets and what are the different categories, how do we go about doing the long-range planning for the capital. So spending a lot of time and attention in 2013 wasn't currently on our work plan. It was something more that we were going to be working on for next year.
Okay. Those are my questions. Thanks.
Other questions, comments? So, is there a list of what we talked about that needs to be addressed?
So I have one, in terms of decisions, which was what percent should the general fund be set at? So we had a variety of discussion points, but at least in terms of what I heard for takeaways on decision points, that was it. And then the other piece was helping to define what the measure of success is, which was Tola's comment, whether it should be a AAA or not. And
Josh?
So I had my page open, just waiting for the time to bring it up. The current funding guidelines of specific funds or programs, and that was a policy discussion at the last work session that we deferred discussion on, things like human services funding.
Well, I wanted to sort of wrap up the policy thing before we move to that.
Oh, I saw it as part of the,
so
I didn't know where it fit. It seemed to me
Oh,
that it
okay.
fit under the policies, but.
from a practical standpoint, like, what we've talked about is this document gets adopted, once, and then council will review it on a periodic basis. This thing would be something that you do like a resolution every year. So this refers to this, but this may change on a regular basis.
How is that different from looking at it with the budget every year?
You mean this
Yeah,
or
You're-
this?
this.
Which is the supplement? That gets done every year. So before we do the budget, you would take a look at it and you'd say, do we still want to commit $100,000 to arts? You may first look at this big sheet, right, and say, oh, we're going to have a problem, we may need to make an adjustment.
Okay.
And so this is what starts to
Pre-budget.
provide.
Yeah,
Exactly,
pre-budget.
pre-budget.
Just a lot different than doing it during the budget review.
Exactly.
Okay.
But that doesn't seem like then we're making a policy on these things. We're just engaging in our normal budgetary checks and balances and weighing, whether we want to implement something on one year and then it changes. I mean, changing from year to year doesn't sound like policy. It sounds like discretionary budgetary activity. And that's why I saw these things as hard policy, that if we're going to say we're contributing no more than 50% of an operating budget to a nonprofit, that's a hard and fast policy rule. Now, granted, some future council can change that policy, just as they can change anything that we've just talked about. But to sort of say, well, we're just going to do it year to year, we'll be right back in the same position we were in the budget discussions this year. And then we'd be again in 2014 and 2015, and every year we just keep talking about it instead of saying, what is the policy that this council believes we should do on these things? Now, maybe some of these we do year to year because they're more squishy, like arch funding, but when we're talking about things like the nonprofit funding, that was brought up as a hard and fast policy decision that originally it was Mark Mullet who wanted us to have a rule on with regards to that and a council decision on that issue. So it's kind of hard, because then when the mayor does make the budget, the mayor doesn't know at that point, what is the council going to want to do with that? And so then the mayor makes the budget and says, well, we're going to contribute 60%, 70% of the operating costs to one of these organizations, and then the council goes back and changes that. Instead of knowing up front, this is the council policy to set it at this percentage, if that's what we want to do. But that's the policy question. So that's why I saw it as fitting within this larger framework instead of just a yearly discussion.
Want me to take this one?
Sure, and I'll help supplement
Okay,
what you say.
so generally, when you have financial and budget policies, they're the overarching policies that provide the guidance. When you get into the specific funding and allocation of resources, those are typically evaluated by councils each year as part of your goal setting and development process. The negative by putting in more restrictions on unrestricted revenue takes away the council's flexibility to adapt to change. And also, when you were just talking about wanting to be a five-star city, if you start committing into writing that every single year, 30% of your sales tax revenue is going to be dedicated for capital and only capital, when an outside party is looking at that, they now say that you've taken virtually 95% of your revenue, and you now have made it restricted revenue. So therefore, when something happens and you have an emergency, you have no way to work with it within that emergency. So you generally keep these more global, more generic, and then when you talk about funding, you do those annually to reaffirm where you want to go, given the current times and economic condition.
So it's been my impression, and so that was my understanding from before, that's consistent with my understanding, and that the mayor and the administration would prefer that we, as a council, vet this and give guidance at this level prior to the budget season.
This
So
is
it's
the
not a
get.
post, okay, we've got it, now let me see, do we like it? It's more of going in, here would be,
The lights.
going in here would be the goal, got it.
This is what we told you to do and you did it.
This is to get the council and the mayor, administration in concert, so that when we develop these things, because right now, in theory, what you want to do is look at your 5-year forecast and see where the revenue is going to be, and then come back to this and say, are there any adjustments that we kind of need to make to this before because in a sense, what you're doing is restricting, as you just said, undesignated revenues.
So when would we do that?
So this would get done before the budget process. So typically, it would be like a June or July workshop where you would have this conversation. Is that right? Is that what you're kind of looking at?
Yeah.
That's right, it's here. Well, remember, we've not done this before. So really, I mean, what you're looking at next year, this helps give us some discretion. But for next year, it's going to be this whole process is going to be a lot smoother as we start to go through it. But you do restrict the mayor's ability when you adopt this thing. So, if you say it's $10 per capita and you put it in this policy, the main one, the mayor's got to put it at $10. It's off the top revenue, and the mayor may come back and say, we've got a financial situation when we develop the budget that we were not anticipating, or whatever the situation is, and may need to make an adjustment, and it may be in that particular area.
Paula?
So just to be clear, I want to make sure I understand. This doesn't bind the administration as to what it proposes, and it doesn't bind the council as to what they will vote on in October and November, right? Because if the economic situation changes between, let's say, June and November, everybody has the right to have to revisit it, right? It's just the guidelines to help all of us evaluate where are you deviating from, where are the exceptions, right? We have how we'd like to do things, where council often does well when we know, where are we moving away from the trend line, right? And that helps us understand that, right?
So when we put the budget together, say the $100,000 for arch funding, the mayor will put that in there, and you may go through your process and decide, we've got a $400,000 hole because council's got some other priorities this year, and we're going to change the policy or the guideline and say we're going to fund arch 50%.
Or we're going to depart from the guideline, however.
Exactly. So it's really making kind of an adjustment. But really what this does is it helps set the baseline for us for the administration developing the budget for that year.
Well, it seems like it would help reduce surprises too, right? We had last year, just to pick one as an example, human services was one that there's some churn that could perhaps, there could be less churn if everybody agreed early on what the baseline was, and you could talk about deviating potentially from the baseline, but there would be a baseline.
That's right. And the challenge we had with that one is they do their grants on a 2-year basis, biennial basis, and we do our budget on an annual basis. So it caused some challenges as we went through that process.
One other question, how come we identified those particular 4 community asset fundings as opposed to any others?
Because that's what's in the budget right now. So that's one of the discussion points that we wanted to have with you is, you know, we go through a process. There's a whole variety of processes that we go through. So, but one of these is, as it relates to the general fund, the mayor has worked with, you know, various agencies, and they've put in revenues for these items, and it's kind of outside of the normal review process for some of these other items in terms of a committee or a commission or whatever. Did you want to say something?
Well, you have your municipal arts fund, and that goes through a competitive review process. You have your lodging advisory tax fund, where they go through, evaluate, and make recommendations. These don't, like Bob said, they don't go through any committee. They are just simply things that have been in your budget for many years.
I'm confused because all of those have come before Services and Safety in the past and asked for money every year. Are we
That was
proposing
an
changing that?
interesting process that you had last year.
So is this proposing to change that?
No, these have always been, several of these have been in the budget, that when we put those together, that goes through that. I mean, it doesn't go to Services and Safety, it's just the mayor's decision when they put the budget together.
I'm still confused because all 4 of those come before Services and Safety, the 4 that are in there.
So they do that kind of nonprofit presentation, if you remember right at the beginning of the budget process, the full council.
The first night.
Right. But, Right.
I'm sorry, that's right. It's not, it's in the same room as Services.
that's right.
That would be my confusion. I'm
It's
sorry.
okay.
Yes.
So, so there's that, there's,
You're like, what is Tola talking
You
about?
don't recall that, Eileen?
yeah.
Sorry.
So there's a process for that, and there's funds that they're competing for within the budget. And I'm forgetting off the top of my head where that money is coming from. But then there's also a process.
The human services funding.
Human services.
The $8.50.
Okay. Yes, and then there's what comes out of the general fund, and they're kind of grants. And so the mayor has put those together, and they're usually found in miscellaneous, miscellaneous projects, or, I can't remember the
They're
title.
actually found in different places. We had to
Yeah.
find them ourselves and pull them out.
Right. So this is, the only reason it's on here is right now, it is up to the mayor's discretion when they put that budget together on what a community asset is and how much money to allocate towards that, and they do that. You know, so if the council wants to provide any other direction in advance of the budget being done, well, you know, for example, why is the Village Theater a community asset this year? And, you know, why is it more important or less important this year than some of the other community assets? You can provide that general direction. Maybe not assigning a number, because the mayor still will do that in their budget, but it may be a question of who ends up on the community asset list or not. Does council want to have some input into that process before the mayor puts that budget together? And this is outside of what council typically does, and that's the only reason why I think we're having this discussion.
Would there still be them coming before the council, or?
So it's really, what this is general fund funding of these projects. So you still, when the budget gets presented to council and you go through your review process, you're still looking at all the general fund accounts. So you still have an opportunity to look at that, but this has been kind of outside of the normal presentations that, so like Fish, the 30,000, I think it's for education and some other, or capital, for the docent program. There was probably.
educational programs that go on.
Yeah, There
Well,
was
this is-
probably a decision made a long time ago that the city is a partner there and is committed to this, and these funds have been used for that for a long, long time.
Well, this is a new category that I'm not sure I was aware of, community asset funding.
Because we just kind of titled it that way.
But it's a good
Right.
title, because I look at these things and I don't know what the real definition, but in my mind, I visualize these as community assets. And so,
So I'm still confused about the process. So in June or July, theoretically, or what's being proposed, is we would have a discussion and the council would give some direction, sort of an annual guideline about this. The
So-
community asset.
Yeah, so what I would anticipate is, don't look at the numbers
Yeah.
right now, is what's a community asset or
I
not,
think
right? And that's the question.
And so then when the budget comes out, the draft budget comes out, then these organizations would still come before us?
So on the community asset funding, these are things that the mayor kind of develops and puts in a separate, now, you may want to include that in your review process, but you remember, there are different funds that these various agencies can apply for and
Okay.
compete for. This has just been general fund grants that the city has provided. And so, for what we would call community assets, because that's really what they are. And they fund specific programs, and the mayor in the past has put those in. There's still a review process when you go through the budget. You looked at, well, you know, what's the village, the $25,000 contribution kind of mean? Now, the council added to that because they ended up taking some money out of LTAC and funded through the LTAC fund some additional funds that went to that project. But these have generally been at the mayor's discretion to fund, to propose funding for these community assets. I think the key question is, you know, what is a community asset? We're having some discussion of that really at the LTAC committee too, of how those assets kind of, or that funding gets allocated.
Joe?
If you recall last year at the budget process, the mayor presented $10, and when the council got it, they reduced it. And if you recall, the human services people were really upset because they base their budgets on what they anticipate the mayor put in her budget. So what this would allow us to do is to preemptively strike and say, well, we're not going to do $10 this year, we're going to do $8.50, so we don't get into the same situation as last year, specifically with the human services, where they were, okay, well, you've just cut our budget arbitrarily now, we've been depending on this all the time, and I can understand why, if the council feels they want to go $8.50 instead of 10, it's better for everybody to know up front than to wait until we're clear into November to say, okay, we're not going to do that now.
That's a good example.
But if you use the community asset one, the reason I guess I'm confused is because we're just going to be thinking about a list, but still, those community asset organizations would come before us and then still make a pitch for a dollar amount?
So each of these have different processes. So the municipal art fund, if you want to get a allocation of revenue out of that, you have to go to the Arts Commission. They go through, there's an evaluation process, and then they provide a recommendation to council on what should be funded for that year.
Right.
The Human Services Commission works the same way. So the review process for community asset funding and for arts is the executive office. So the executive office goes through and does an evaluation of these community assets, and then they put a number affiliated with them in consultation with the various groups as we start to have those conversations. So, you know, for example, the Cougar Mountain Zoo isn't on here. Now, there would be some question, is that a community asset or not? And they're going through a major capital campaign, and there's an evaluation process that the mayor would go through if the mayor decided to put some revenue towards that or not. They haven't in the past, but there's a process involved with that. Now, ultimately, you can see what the expenditures have generally been, but that can change on a regular basis. There were a couple of years there where the city didn't have sufficient funding to fund the village theater, and so that was cut out of the budget.
So would At Work then still come before the full council the first night of budget deliberations and talk to us about what they've done, where they're going, to try to influence us at making a final decision on the budget?
Yes,
Okay.
but that's coming from a different revenue source.
Okay. All right.
some of these things I can understand doing up front so that there's more certainty, and Joe's point is well taken about, you know, the $10 versus the $8.50. But there's a flip side argument that I can think of to that, which is sometimes you don't know until the budget is in front of you what you can afford to spend it on. And so with the per capita spending last year, if that decision had been made up front, then there would have been trade-offs in the budget. And it wasn't until we got there and said, you know, we actually need to reduce this so we can use those funds for other sorts of projects. And there's always the give and take. So I think some of these things are different than the others. I mean, I really see the 50% of operating cost as an actual policy decision so that the organizations have certainty coming in, that they know we're not asking for above X dollars because we're not getting it. But some of these other things, you know, you look at the per capita spending. If you were to ask me right now, is $8.50 or $10 the right amount? I have no idea. And especially this year where there's the potential of adding a significant amount of residents next year that would increase that per capita pretty significantly. So there's calculations that could change even as we get into October and November, that it would be impossible for me to make a policy decision in July. You know, if we had extra revenue and there's a 6%, you know, I'll call it a surplus, whatever you want to call it, difference between reserves in the general fund and, you know, excess, and I'm probably not using financial terms, but, you know, I'll call it those things, more money, then yeah, $10 per capita, that sounds great. You know, but on the other hand, if we've got millions of dollars in some other project that's of critical importance, that's going to influence my thinking on whether $10 is really the right number. So some of these I think you can do up front, but some of these I don't think you can. And so I don't see these all being lumped together in that sort of June or July type of analysis.
I mean, that happens now. And that's because the mayor puts the budget together and you get the budget. And the mayor makes a decision what can be afforded and can't be afforded, and then the council reviews that. And then you go through your review process. But that's kind of the standard thing. And I think part of this is just, as we talked about, getting harmony between the final budget that gets presented to council for review in advance, because we want to try and avoid the situation, if we can, like we ran into with the human services in the past year. But ultimately, the mayor has the statutory authority under our process to develop the budget. And so if you decide not to do this, you know, even if you decided to do 10, the mayor may come back and put in 8, and then there's going to have to be an explanation to council, why did Jay cut out $2 per capita? And that's going to be, that'll be on one of your agendas for that evening in terms of going through these processes and seeing why the variances. And you may agree or disagree with that final recommendation, and then if you disagree, you're going to have to make an adjustment in the budget.
So where are we with this discussion? Help me out.
On this piece here? So I guess part of this is, kind of come back to your question. Do you want these on the list as part of this pre-review of when we do the budget or not? And so there's context. Because at that point, you know, the finance department is going to be putting the budget together based on the mayor's recommendations, and you'll get that preview when you do that.
So what's the question?
So, for example, the municipal art fund, 100% of admissions tax dedicated to municipal arts program and infrastructure. Do you still want it to be 100%? Doesn't have to be. It can be something different. But our general policy has been 100%. In capital,
Eileen, I don't think you
I
may have just turned your...
I did, I turned it on. And I agree with that because, I mean, if you have to go back in history as to when this particular fund was started, it was for municipal arts because there was no other place for which to get dollars for the arts in the community. And so that's where this fund was developed from, was to provide those dollars for art.
Up or down?
I don't disagree with Eileen's statement. I do think, as I did last budget cycle, that the Art East funding should have come from the Municipal Art Fund because it's logically related to the purposes of that fund. And I raised that point in last year's budget, and I think we didn't take it out of that fund. We took it out of general fund. But I still think when we look at the Art East funding, labeled as community asset, that there's a more logical relationship to the municipal art fund for funding that. So, food for thought for October.
Well, I guess the other, typically the Arts Commission, when they go through and they, dispense the dollars or grant the dollars out, it's for performing arts that would be for public enjoyment, the Shakespeare in the Park piece, which doesn't cost any dollars. So it's for the actual art pieces that are throughout our community. It's not necessarily for the purpose of providing dollars to pay rent for Art East, or however they're asking for those dollars to maintain their organization. They're a great asset to the community. They bring a lot here. They provide a great, the establishment of the art walks was somewhat filtered from Art East, but it is not a piece of art that is within our city, or it's not a piece of performing art as in Shakespeare in the Park that anyone can attend.
And I'd have to go back and look at the fund's definition of its purpose, but it seemed to match when I looked at it last year.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, we're not going to solve that
Yeah.
tonight, but is there general agreement that we'll not change the policy that we've had in the past for funding the municipal arts fund? And 100% of admission tax dedicated.
Did you mean guideline or policy?
Guideline. It says guideline right at the top. Capital Improvement Fund, 25% of general sales tax dedicated to this fund. Is that, anyone see any reason to change that?
What does it do if you change it? Like, what does that mean? I'm trying to understand what 25% of general sales tax means for purposes of capital improvement. If you were to increase that number to 30%, what more could you buy? Or if you were to decrease it to 20, what would you lose?
You see what we're getting into?
Yes.
I mean,
And so,
that's really not the topic for this evening.
There's sort of questions without
I mean, we can't have an intelligent discussion around this because we don't have all of the information.
So is this typically what has been, this is past history, so this is typically for all of the budgets we've looked at in the last number of years,
This
it's
is
current policy.
This is what it's been for a number of years.
and that's why for this year, it may not be possible to make a decision on this tonight. But it's something we ought to be looking at.
Well, the truth of the matter is, I suspect that the proposed budget that we get is going to designate 25% of the general fund for the capital improvement fund, unless there is a reason to deviate from that we're not aware of at this time. And the same thing for the street improvement fund, the 5% for that. I would suspect that it will, that's what we'll see unless there is a valid reason.
So is the budget going to tell us, if you change that equation, what happens? I mean, will we be given that knowledge? And I'm not looking for, well, if you set it at 17 or 18%, I just kind of want to know
So
if
if
it's
you-
5, 10, or 0,
If you
within-
don't dedicate it to these funds, it goes into the general fund. So the more you take and transfer to these funds, you've got less financing ability, funding ability in the general fund. If you take away, if you reduce this, you just got less revenue in the capital fund. That's essentially what it means.
Arch capital funding.
I get it, I'm good with that.
That makes sense?
Human services.
Which really should be titled nonprofit. I think to be consistent with before, I think number 5 is, the subject is probably nonprofit. The first line is about human services. And then the second one is just the general nonprofit thing.
I don't know what that means. I
So-
mean, I know that what it was last year. I know that some have suggested that it be $10 per capita, but Josh raised some interesting points. I don't know what it ought to be.
So I think the mayor laid out her perspective, which is the budget's going to be $10 per capita next year.
Okay,
And that's what you're going to get, and then
That's-
you'll have to make that.
Then why don't we
those-
being asked tonight?
Because if
If we're going to cut it.
If you're going to cut it,
She wants to know
yeah.
ahead of time.
Because I think what happened last time was there was this increase from approximately 7, it was 7 something, to 850, and there was a lot of, and so we went through this process of, just because of timing, Human Services Commission giving grants and then having to come back and redo their whole process. So, but I think last year she laid out and said, it's my intent to develop a budget that in 2 years it's $10 per capita
Okay.
as a general policy.
And is the second line in their nonprofit funding not to exceed 50% of operating costs, is that to the human service,
Nonprofits in general.
not, or nonprofits in general?
I thought that was nonprofits in general.
Um,
So it probably
Should be a number
should be
6.
a separate line and not lumped with the human services.
Well, that's why I think the section is titled nonprofits.
Yeah, it should be cut that.
So I think there's a bit of context. I know we want to get to that contingency funding issue still. That in the budget deliberation process last year, what eventually evolved, that there was a recognition that it was balanced because we borrowed from ending fund balance. The proposed budget was balanced, but we were using some of the ending fund balance. And it came out, well, let's not do that. And so what do we take out of this spending to reduce the amount we're taking out of ending fund balance? So it seems to me it's that type of goal or objective. If we're very clear on that, then you work with these numbers, and then, okay, and if we say it's going to be 10 per capita, for example, well, then then I would expect the whole budget would come in front of us, would meet that objective, whether or not, what are you doing with ending fund balance? And if it's consistent with that objective going in, and you can still do this, then we're good. Which means that maybe some spending in some other area isn't proposed, because there's not a specific guideline for it. So maybe some capital, tennis courts or wood posts instead of metal posts, whatever. I can't do those because we have guidelines for these. We also have a guideline of what we're trying to achieve with ending fund balance. It seems to me that was the lever that said, and that's why the Human Services one even got on the list to maybe take off, along with maybe about a dozen others. So that's the piece that we're not discussing, is what is that goal, some of those other goals, such as ending fund balance. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm. I think, the thing is, on this piece, is all of these are within the mayor's discretion to develop and propose. And I think it comes back to the initial comment that Fred made, is all we're trying to do is get some harmony at the front end of the budget process so you're absolutely right. On the fund balance, the reason for that discussion last time was how the mayor put her budget together. There's implications to that, which is what we've kind of talked about.
Well, I would love to see harmony, but it is,
9:15.
it's difficult to, you have more information than we have.
Right.
You are at a significant advantage over us right now talking about these things, because you know things that we don't know.
So I think, again, speaking to this, when we look, we really need to think about this as we go through the review process and the budget this year, that it helps set the guidelines for 2014. It's
Well,
really
I
what
would,
it does.
I would almost submit that the time to have this discussion is during the council goal-setting retreat in late April, early May, and, not right now, because you've already done a fair amount of work on the budget. I mean, you've got over a month invested in that, and we don't. We provided goals for the proposed budget for next year that, impact that, and the work plan for next year. Where are we? Well, look,
I'm struggling on how to say this right. If we have, I would like to have this process, maybe not tonight, maybe not at 9:20 p.m., but this 6%, I think that we as a council should get some clarity about that. If the mayor comes back with 10% on human services, and we have clarity on our 6%, and we have clarity on how we maintain fiscal prudence, then I think we'll have we'll have a more smooth budget process in October. But if we do not have, clarity on it, then you might get some of the same issues where you have some council members who say you can't, you might get some of the churn that you saw last year. So I sincerely hope that, again, maybe not tonight, but, we're still 3 months away from making any decisions on a budget. And, I'm perfectly open to, we're looking at ending fund balance and are we at the right level and all that, but I want it within a context, myself personally as one of 7, I want it within the context of this process and having a certain amount of predictability going into the budget. So I'm just saying that it concerns me a little bit when you say it's going to be 10%. Like if you had 7 council members who said we thought human services should be at 5%, which you clearly don't, but if you did and you said, well, it's going to be 10% anyhow, that's not a great situation to be in, right? But so I'm just saying that I want to accomplish what we collectively want, and if we have more clarity on this 6% and how we're going to go about it, you'll have a lot more harmony when we get around to working the budget. Thank you.
Where are we in our discussion this evening?
I think we're ready to, unless Ms. Goodman
I just-
has
Oh,
comments.
sorry, Stacy.
I just had one comment, and it's that my issue with looking at these is that I don't really have any context.
Yeah, you need context.
And so it's a question that, they're all a list of questions, and if I knew, why the $10, then I'd probably say fine. So that's kind of where I'm having the problem tonight. It might look good and it might feel good, but that, to me, is not a reason to make a decision.
I think that sums it up quite nicely, Stacy. Okay, let's move on. What is next?
Contingency.
Big one. The big one.
Well, what we did was we handed out the second quarter financial report. In the interest of time, you can look at this on your own, and we did make some improvements, and we added some additional pieces of information that heretofore have not been included, particularly on sales tax. We did some rewrite and hoped to improve the clarity on what's happening in the general fund, in particular the revenues and departmental expenditures. So you've seen this report in a different way. I think we just enhanced it compared to previous quarters with a little bit more information. So if you have any questions, let me know.
I have a general comment, and I looked at this this afternoon, and I tell you, this just gets better and better, and does a good job. It's providing the information that I think the council needs, that's relevant and it's important, and so I really appreciate the improvements that have been made, and this has come a long way.
Plus one.
So probably the last piece is this long document that is the 5-year financial forecast. I'd love to say that this one piece of paper is the only document used in order to develop this, but there's massive spreadsheets that we developed in order to get to this one-page summary. A financial forecast, let's maybe talk a little bit about what a financial forecast is. A financial forecast is basically looking at the cost of services, what we think they're going to go up, what pieces of information we already have knowledge about that we think is going to cause changes. And then it's effectively looking at what are we doing today and what does that cost look like into the future. It really doesn't look at capital and infrastructure improvements. It doesn't look at adding a whole bunch of additional staff. It pretty much says, where are we at today and what does the future look like and what are the things that we need to consider when develop the model. So what we have presented is we have 2009 and 2012 budget actual, and then we have the 2013 budget, and then we have the forecast for 2014 through 2019. If you look at the very bottom of it, you'll see the difference between revenues and expenditures, and I lost the title on it, but it's in the first column on the left-hand side. In 2009, we actually had a shortfall between revenues and expenditures of 1.29 million. Then you see in 2010 and 2011, we began some course correction. A lot of that is due to the Great Recession. You made a lot of reductions, particularly in 2010, in order to deal with the situation. In 2012, you ended up using about $200,000 of ending fund balance in order to cover expenditures. A lot of that was, if you look at the projection for sales tax, I brought it up to you on a couple of different occasions. If you look at the second line down from the top, go over to 2012 budget versus 2012 actuals, you can see that we were nearly $700,000 off in our sales tax projections. So that caused, in addition to working with departments and asking them to conserve, what we also had to do is we had to use fund balance because the revenue estimates just simply were not being met. In 2013, we're anticipating using $400,000 of beginning fund balance in order to balance the 2013 budget. But probably more importantly, what the prior finance director had done is they had programmed $750,000 in LID guarantee money. That is really one-time money in order to balance the 2013 budget. It is administration's goal to find ways not to use that, because effectively once you use it, it is gone, and there's every probability that we would have to replace it. And what it simply does is it just simply defers the difficult decision into future periods. So we're trying to see how within the 2013 budget we can make some adjustments to not become dependent upon that. So then when you look at the pieces that the finance department has responsible for going 14 through 19. You can see that in 2014, we barely balanced. We have like $50,000 potentially to play with. You'll see that in 2015, we have a shortfall of about $350,000. That is primarily related to the fire district. It's anticipated in 2015 we'll become responsible for a greater portion of Station 78. They're estimating someplace between $450,000 to $500,000, so we programmed that in. In 2016, we're hopeful that the revenue stream continues to grow, and then you can see when we move out into the future, we seem to be looking okay with the revenue growth. The revenue growth, the one piece I have to kind of put a caveat to is the way we do our development and development revenue is different than most communities use, and I'm still trying to get a handle on it and still understand how the revenue stream is really working. It works for the community, but I still have a lot of learning to do in order to understand it. There is a summary document that sort of talks about, our sales tax. One of the things is some finance people, they overestimate expenditures and underestimate revenue. I try to sort of not use the pessimistic or the optimistic. I try to be really realistic, because it really impacts either how departments get to operate in the future or our ability to add new or different programs if the revenue streams are increasing. So some of the other things some of the assumptions is you'll see that in revenues, particularly in sales tax, was pretty assertive in their growth. I added $300,000 beginning in 2014 for the opening of the various shops up in the Highland area. And then you can see that on the memo page in 2014, I grew it by 3.5%, 4.3, 5.4, 5.2, 4.3. Now, because we don't have economists on staff, what I look to is some of the larger cities like King County and Seattle and Bellevue that have the opportunity to hire economists to help them with some of this forecasting. And I sort of look at where their numbers at, look at, kind of take the low or the average, depending on what it is, and use that for this community. So they're all indicating some strong revenue growth in sales tax. In general, the other revenue streams in the general fund, I grew by 3%. Some of them I grew by a greater percentage than 3%. For instance, electricity and gas. If we're having growth, there is, I grew that by 6%, so I was assuming that part of it was simply rate increases, but another portion of it was simply due to growth in the community. On the general fund expenditure side, I pretty much looked at the forecast for the consumer price index, sort of followed that, and said on the expenditure side, supplies, material and equipment, typically, you know, they grow along with the CPI index, because that's what measures the CPI index. So I grew expenditures exclusive of salary and benefits by these general percentages. Salaries and benefits, you'll see, are the next line. We have a lot of, we added some things in. The whole healthcare industry is a big unknown at this particular time. Beginning in 2014, we have to, just for instance, we have to pay $65 per participant that is part of our insurance program. So if you are a family of 5, then we pay $65 per participant. So we continue to have, and also the fact that we only have 6 months worth of history as far as operating our new self-insurance fund. I looked at a 5% increase in our rates for next year, dropped that down in 16 and 17 to 1%, because hopefully by then we'll have sufficient revenue set aside for our reserves. So pretty much, you know, we have close to probably 2,000 line items in the general fund. Pretty much looked at every single line item, evaluated it, put a percentage increase based upon the history, based upon what we know. So we're not doing bad. You know, part of the solution might be in, by the time 2015 comes around, our earlier conversation might be, you know, in 2015, in order not to rely upon the LID guarantee fund, maybe we reduce our contribution to the CIP fund and use some of the sales tax in order to balance the general fund. So those are some, you know, probably 2014 is 80% accurate as we move forward to the budget, you know, and the further out you go, the greater the volatility or the differences are. So, you know, don't hang your hat on 2015 through 2019, because there's still a lot of changes. On the back side of the memo, there's a couple of things like beginning in 2018, depending on what our health care coverage plan is, we could be facing a 40% excise tax on the value of our health care plans if they are above a certain dollar amount. Another big thing is the Marketplace Fairness Act. Congress is currently looking at taxing internet sales tax. We believe that will have, we don't know how that will then impact our, at the state level, our streamline mitigation money. So there's some volatility there until we can figure out what's happening in that area. So this is our best estimate at 9:32 on Monday night on where we think we're going in the future. And then we'll update it based upon how the, you know, as we get closer, because it is July. And I think as Councilmember Mark said, you know, as we get into August and September, we refine those numbers, we get a little bit better pieces of information, and we can adjust the course. The nice thing is all this stuff is all linked together so that when we start changing some of our numbers, it just sort of feeds all of these different spreadsheets now.
Well, thank you for that. I believe that there was a lot of work that went into this to try to pull it all together, and I appreciate that.
The tools we have in place to do this are woefully lacking.
Fred?
So,
Can I ask a quick-
of course.
I know the hour's late, but, so it looks like in general, revenues are going up about 4% per year, taken out over the 10 years, and expenditures are going up about 3.5%, which is nice, right? It's better than the reverse. How does that compare to other municipalities? Is that comparable to other east side municipalities? Are we ahead of the curve, behind the curve?
You know, not too many of them are publishing them. When I looked at Bellevue and Sammamish, they're both balancing their budgets, which is where you ultimately want to be. The difficulty is they don't give you the assumptions, so if they had a revenue surplus, they might have added a program in there based upon that revenue surplus, and you don't really know because you're not in the inner workings. I think, you know, like I said, the revenues, particularly on sales tax, they were a stretch for me to use those percentages, but you know, the east side is very different than where I've traditionally understood the activity. So we'll monitor them and stay on top of them, but I think all in all, we're looking really good.
Great. Thank you.
What else do we need to do this evening?
I think that you wanted to have a discussion on what percent the general fund.
8 or the
Yeah,
reserve?
The reserve.
Were we going to talk about the rainy day fund
That's
issue
for
as
sure.
well? Is that-
It's not the reserve.
thought that-
That's
Well,
that
maybe they're
contingency
related.
reserve.
Maybe they are related.
We kind of got skipped ahead to 5 when we were working on it too,
Yeah.
so.
I mean, it's spend all the excess.
Well, I wasn't
Problem
sure. I
solved.
thought I heard from Councilmember Butler that maybe he wanted to defer this conversation to another day, but,
Well, I said to the end of this.
okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. So, you have a paper. Beth Ann, could you maybe just walk them quickly through some of the benefits and the disadvantages?
Okay,
Where's the paper?
What paper are you talking about?
it was one we handed out tonight. It was on top of the second quarter report. There's a one-page.
What was the date on it? I put these all
July
together by date. 5th. Okay, thank you.
And we apologize, we were just working on so many things that getting everything out has been really difficult.
So, yeah.
Oh, so this is not a cover letter for the report.
It's not a cover letter for the-
Oh, I've got it.
Here's, if you need it, here's another handout.
Okay, Beth
Okay,
Ann,
thank
You got it, okay.
Thank you.
talk to us.
Well, I see a lot of advantages.
What you said at the bottom.
That's right. Well, I think some of it is that the council goals for long-term financial sustainability. We talked earlier about, you know, having your ongoing revenues pay for your ongoing expenses. So when you get one-time money, you know, the best practices, I believe, Government Finance Officers Association, they like the 15%, 2 months of operating reserve. But in addition to that, a rainy day fund or the contingency fund for emergencies. And I guess I look at it from like a home budget where, you know, to be financially flexible, if you have a savings account for your monthly expenses, that's good. But then also if you have another savings pot in case the furnace goes out or you get flooding, or you have a car accident, you know, and you need the $500 for your deductible. So I kind of see it from a business perspective of having the operating reserve, which is covering your cash flow and your liquidity on your operating expenses, and then the contingency fund being more of an emergency fund for those dips. So you have the flexibility. You can avoid interest costs, because if you don't have that money and something happens, you'll end up having to borrow. And if you don't have revenue coming in, the cost for borrowing will go up. Also, or you can't provide services to the citizens. So,
Well, Beth Ann, that is great. The hour is late. Is
Okay.
there anyone who
So the
does not
disadvantage-
feel that a contingency fund is something that we ought to pursue? Josh?
Well, I have a question, I guess, that might help me decide that.
Well, ask.
Can you take those funds that are put into a contingency fund, and can that fund become interest-bearing? Or is it, the money just sits there?
No, it would be invested. It would be money that would earn interest, and that's an advantage too, because sometimes to build up a contingency fund, you take your one-time monies to put in there, but also any interest earnings start building up that balance. If you want to do set aside and you say you want a certain amount, then you start working towards that amount. And
Okay, so what's the expected rate of return on setting aside in a contingency fund? I mean, is there a percentage?
Well, it depends right now in this market. If you have any personal investments, you know you're probably not earning a great rate of return, particularly in the bond market. You know, probably going out 5 years, we could probably do 2% right now. But part of it too, in creating the contingency in a fund, it isn't an all or nothing. You know, this body could set a goal of saying, you know, we want to do 500,000 this year, whatever number. I think if I remember right, the maximum was about 2.6 million is the max you can put into the fund. But you can do that over a period of time as you want to see what's happening in the general fund. It isn't an all or nothing. You have a whole continuum in making that decision. Part of the other benefit too is that typically the general fixed assets, not our utilities, but right now we don't have a place to go to if, for instance, something was to happen to City Hall roof. And so rather than having a mad scramble, you do have that emergency fund to help pay for any of those unusual transactions. Like the other day, when the power went out, particularly in this building, we were scrambling and we were having some major problems because we had no heat, no air conditioning in this building, and it started to damage some of our servers. It could have been worse than what it was, and then we would have to go looking for money
Well, I think,
versus having
Diane, I
money.
think we see the wisdom in that.
I'm not so sure I do, but, I mean, we're not voting on it.
We're not voting, we're having a discussion. Other questions?
Well, I mean, I guess the only thing I'd say is just, you know, I budget the same way that Beth Ann talked about, having a savings account and having money set aside. The difference is that money's not restricted by the RCW. And so if you have to go find the money because your servers melt, the money's still there. It's whether it's in a restricted account or an unrestricted general fund. So the money's still going to be there if it's there and it's not spent. And so in my mind, what you're saying by setting aside a contingency fund is we don't trust ourselves not to spend that money on other things. We want it set aside in case there's an emergency. But I think we've done a good job, and the councils, at least over the last 6 years, have done a good job of not just burning through that, again, excess, I'll call it, whatever it is, overage, extra cash. And so honestly, I just don't see the need, nor do I see the need when there's potential for significant growth on a population basis as well as infrastructure, that we can't at this moment, in my opinion, know what that entails for the city next year. And I think this sort of decision should wait until the events that are going to happen over the next few months suss themselves out, and we can see what the city's going to look like in 2014. So that's just my 2 cents.
Very quickly, it seems like there's 3 interconnected facets, right? One is a potential contingency. One is our policy on general fund. And then the third is sort of flex, whether it's melting servers or skate parks that we want to change. At the end of the day, we'll have to come up with a policy that balances those out. I mean, 6% of our expenditures is over $2 million, right? So you could say, okay, take that 6%, fire it straight into a contingency, but then we all know that as exceptions come up, then we're going to have to, you'd have to have a level of micromanagement. So to me, it just seems like these 3 pieces are all interconnected, and we need to have closure on the 3 cohesively, because it'll affect how the administration can work and how the council can govern.
Joe?
I agree.
Arlene? Paul?
So what are you agreeing to? I mean, so what you...
I'm agreeing not to have a contingency.
What you just said made a lot of sense, so how are we going to do that?
I'm assuming that we don't have a bill in front of us, right? We don't have we're not agreeing to any language, so I'm assuming that at a date later, we're going to see a proposal that would put these pieces together as a modification of this document. Is that, maybe I shouldn't assume that. Because there's no number associated with this contingency reserve, right?
So the alternatives, in the agenda, Bill, is to establish one, not to establish one, but look at all of the full range of alternatives.
Well, and I guess, some of it is, I understand your point, but I think looking at if we want to get to a AAA rating, setting this aside is a point in our favor to basically improve our credit rating. It's a component of that. And I think that is one reason if that's a priority or that's something we want to aspire to, this might be one of those things on that memo of what we need to do to move towards a AAA rating. Because definitely external agencies look at that as being prudent. So.
Well, I would agree with several of the comments. I have some reservations about setting aside money that we've been really good about setting aside anyway.
Okay.
I understand that about the only, the negative I see to not setting it up is perhaps the inability to improve your credit rating, and so that would be one of the reasons to set something aside. But we don't have that, as you mentioned, the memo yet that talks about what kinds of things we might do to get there, and I'm not convinced yet, I should say.
So my sense is that if I was doing a budget and I knew that there was a policy of reserves in general fund being 15% of expenditures, okay, like you said, after servicing debt, there's a couple things. There's a big blocks you can put up there, and then if there was a new program such as beginning to fund or establish and build up a contingency fund, you could work with that. It seems to me that if we you have a specific goal for what to put in a contingency, what to have as an ending fund balance as a percentage of expenditures, you're in a much more certain position to complete the rest of your budget. And so I think that's a very key advantage, rather than, well, I'm not really sure what to do with this extra money that's in general fund. It seems to me that you're just adding a lot more certainty to the budget process. So I would say that's a big advantage.
So I'm looking at this general fund forecast summary that everyone puts so much work into, and it's very, very helpful. So we've used the ending fund balance to balance the budget. It looks like we are just about even in 2014. $53,000 is not an awful lot of money when you get right down to it. That's within the margin of error. $350,000 shortfall in 2015. It looks like we could afford it, but it looks like there will be some pressures to take anything over what the reserve is to balance the budget when we need it.
And I think the other thing is what somebody said earlier. If we're going to make 15%, that means somebody's going to spend 6% because we don't need it now. And I like the idea of having $7 million there that we can use or we don't have to use. And, I'd much rather have that with the idea it's there than to put 15% away someplace and then say, well, gee, now that we've got the 15% away, I guess we don't need our ending fund balance so much, and start going through it real quick.
Maybe 6%.
15% would be the ending fund balance.
You'd put 6% away. See, that's why we need a proposal
There would
in
be
front of us.
6%. What are you going to do with it?
So the question is, it's in the policies, is do you have a contingency fund or not? Right? And so the mayor, when she puts the budget together, would put, if there's a fund there, she would propose an appropriation to that fund. I mean, that's the way it works. Right now, there's just no fund.
Right.
So the alternative is, I mean, I think the intent was to get this financial policy adopted by council. But if it's not there, the mayor can, during the budget process, always propose a contingency fund and allocate money towards that, and council goes through the review process that way. That's the alternative. But I think, I think the intent was to have these general financial policies that would help the city. So we're not talking about the appropriation. A big part of this on the policy piece is not the appropriation piece.
Yeah.
It's just,
Are we going to have it?
are we going to have one?
And so, let's talk a little bit about process. We spent a lot of time talking about policies, and so there were some just suggestions and some wordsmithing and stuff like that. It sounds like we're probably at the point where there would be an agenda bill bringing this to the council for referral to services and safety, and it'll go through our normal process, and the discussion will continue. Is that an accurate summary? I think this has been a great discussion. I don't recall ever spending this much time on financial policies and some of the finer points. So this is very educational for me, and I think for all of us. I appreciate the hard work that's gone into it. I'm glad there's not a part 3.
That starts in October.
But that will start during budget deliberations. Is there anyone in the audience desiring to comment at this time?
Nobody laughed.
Seeing no one, then we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
So do you want to do Monday?
This is set for the 17th. And we have the one item is